Chapter 630. Timeline. The leader of the Naturism sect was named Flight Ken, a man in his 30s. His thin face had brown whiskers, and there were evil-looking tattoos on his neck. He was brought in front of Klein by Leymano. He looked ragged, as though he had suffered the most severe mental torture. Your Excellency, while he was being captured, he kept exchanging his intelligence for strength, and he's on the brink of a mental collapse. Leymano reported the facts, ignoring the possibility that Admiral Emirius could tell the exact details. That's perfect. Klein had been previously worried that, as a lunatic, Flight Ken would refuse to answer his questions while under the mental pressure. That way, he had to take the risk of being suspected of dismissing his subordinates and attempting a spirit channeling. As he looked coldly at Flight Ken, Klein's left hand wore a golden luster under the cover of the desk. He had switched creeping hunger to the interrogator's soul. And interrogator happened to be Sequence 7 of Admiral Emirius's Arbiter Pathway. Deep in Klein's eyes, two indistinct flashes of lightning appeared as they overlapped with Flight Ken's figure. Psychic piercing was poised for attack. However, Klein didn't directly use the Beyonder power, as it was only at the level of a Sequence 7. Once he used it in front of Leymano, he would immediately expose himself to the blonde secretary. With the pressure provided by psychic piercing on Flight Ken's spirit body, Klein sat there like the real Admiral Emirius as he said in a deep voice, "Do you know Cynthia?" As he spoke, he raised his right hand high and dangled the black miniature rhinoceros horn from his palm. What is its use? The dispirited Flight Ken trembled as he felt as if a dagger was being held to his psyche, capable of penetrating him at any moment. He couldn't help but lower his head as he stammered, "Yes, I know her. Cynthia. Miss Cynthia wished to have a child with your Excellency, a child with Beyonder powers. She was introduced to me by her parents. It's a proliferation necklace created with the bestowment of the goddess's aura. By consuming its powder and wearing it for prolonged periods of time, it will be able to make your Excellency unable to resist her." Klein listened in silence as he was half convinced by Flight Ken's explanation. However, he still had his doubts. He believed that it was partially Cynthia's goal. This beautiful lady did wish to have a child with Admiral Emirius, either by her own will or from the urging of others. This could be seen from her persistence even after she mutated. Although the Lone Kingdom's aristocrats didn't like or even discriminated against their illegitimate children, it was situational. A child who had successfully inherited their father's Beyonder characteristics would similarly be given importance. Those ancient families who knew many secrets viewed this with importance, and the Revolt family was one of those families. Furthermore, Admiral Emirius is a stern and old-fashioned man on the surface, but he's someone who treasures his relationships. Even an illegitimate child would receive his love and have importance attached. This might be the real reason why Cynthia was eager to have his child. Klein sighed inwardly. The doubt towards Flight Ken's answer was concentrated on the true effects of the proliferation necklace, as well as the possibility of the Naturism sect deliberate misleading of Cynthia. As he strengthened the pressure brought about by psychic piercing, Klein silently stared into Flight Ken's eyes until he could no longer take it and bowed his head again. "What other uses does this necklace have?" Klein shook the cracked pendant. His tone was calm, as though he knew every secret. His questions were only to obtain the final confirmation. An indescribable pressure inundated Flight Ken, who was already on the brink of a mental collapse. He plopped to the ground and shouted nearly hysterically, It can corrupt you. As long as Cynthia consumed the powder ground from it and sincerely chanted Mother Tree of Desire's honorific name, any man who has sex with her and successfully has a child would be corrupted. That will make you become a believer of the Mother Tree of Desire. To become her blessed. So that's how it is." Klein instantly understood the entire story, and he was no longer puzzled by the mutation that happened that very night. The Naturism sect's goal is to use Cynthia and the proliferation necklace, which looks like an ordinary object, to corrupt Admiral Emirius, making this important military figure of the Lone Kingdom become the Mother Tree of Desire's devout believer. He can then help their sect develop and provide them protection. The key to the success of this method is that it's sufficiently concealed and normal. It is in no way directly connected to terms like potency, strike, and terrifying. Therefore, after 3 rejections from me, Cynthia was unable to expel the corruptive forces in the proliferation necklace's powder from her body. She gradually reached her limit and finally connected with the Mother Tree of Desire and ended up with what seemed like a sudden mutation. Therefore, the monster after the mutation wasn't able to pose any threat to the real Admiral Emirius. Even my usage of the 9th Law charm easily resolved the matter. This is because this wasn't the outcome the Naturism sect wished to have. They wished to have Admiral Emirius be secretly corrupted, and not have a conflict with a demigod. Klein silently looked at the secretary Luan. Luan had also gained a rough understanding of the entire situation. He immediately lowered his head and said in a deep voice, "Your Excellency, it was our oversight. We only monitored Miss Cynthia and the servants here without expanding the monitoring to their friends and family. I'm willing to accept any punishment for this, even if you send me to be court-martialed." How would the real admiral reply? Klein once again immersed himself in the character of Emirius, experiencing his recent pain, helplessness, grief, and anger. He maintained his seating posture and sternly said, "We shall leave this for later." The hidden meaning behind this sentence meant, "I'll decide based on your upcoming performance." Luan was taken aback for a second, seemingly finding the admiral's mild punishment unbelievable. Klein half closed his eyes and said in a deep voice, "My father, the deceased Earl Revolt, once taught me this. He said to pardon the first mistake of a subordinate. Luan, you as well as the other bodyguards should be thankful for his benevolence." Luan's gaze shimmered as he drew a silent breath. He was no longer as calm, as he rather earnestly said, "Your benevolence is admirable. I pledge my utmost loyalty to you, apart from my principles, God and kingdom. The pride in you is extremely exaggerated." Klein didn't believe him as he said seemingly calm, "There's a second half of the saying, that is, punish them for their second mistake." Luan nodded, unsurprised at that. Klein cast his gaze back to Flight Ken, who was slumped on the ground. He pressed without a change in expression, "Who instigated you to do this?" From his point of view, Flight Ken's answer was likely that they had planned it. After coming into contact with Cynthia and learning of her requests and knowing who her lover was, the Naturism sect boldly had the idea of corrupting the naval admiral, Emirius. Flight looked left and right somewhat neurotically as he apprehensively said, "It was the mother tree of desire. She instigated me to do it in my dream. In the beginning, I only wanted to lend Cynthia the proliferation necklace and for her to wear it. I never planned on her consumption of the powder." Instigated by the mother tree of desire? This is almost equivalent to a revelation. Klein nearly frowned. Although Admiral Emirius is an important figure of the lone military and the highest-ranking commander of the Central Sonia Sea, making his standing and power rather tremendous, it shouldn't be important enough to have an evil goddess set her sights on him. However, I'm not an evil god. I have no way of comprehending their thought process. Perhaps the corruption of Emirius is for subsequent plans. Yes, I can't eliminate the possibility that Flight Ken is lying. I'll have to confirm it later. Klein thought before sternly asking, "When did you have this dream?" Flight forced a smile filled with fear and said, "It was nighttime on February 4th last Friday. I remember it very clearly. I had just released The Spirituality of a Lady. 4th February. Klein ruminated over the date, momentarily unable to find anything special about it. After 2 seconds of silence, he turned to ask, "What relationship do you have with the Rose School of Thought? What relationship does the Mother Tree of Desire have with the Chained God?" He wasn't worried that Admiral Emirius might have already known of this, with Secretary Luan having a certain understanding of the matter. This could be easily understood as a confirmation question. Flight Ken revealed a passionate look he could hardly keep in. We're a branch of the Rose School of Thought. My mentor is the Rose School of Thought Saint, Zatwin. The Chained God is another manifestation of the Mother Tree of Desire. The Mother Tree of Desire is the true and only deity that surpasses the 7 gods and the true creator. Your Excellency, you are a candidate to be her blessed. Who can't brag? Can it be understood that the Mother Tree of Desire is an alt of the Chained God? According to the evil spirit in the underground ruins suspected to be Red Angel Medici, the prisoner path of the divine and the devil pathway can be swapped. Therefore, it's no surprise that the Rose School of Thought's Chained God can magnify the various desires of creatures. They have the temperance and indulgence factions internally. This matches the situation. Klein thought as he turned his head to Luan and said, "Go out for a while." He planned on questioning Flight Ken on whether he had done anything evil, and if he was suitable to be Creeping Hunger's meal. "Yes, Your Excellency." Luan didn't ask why as he briskly walked out the study and closed the door behind him. After the echoing sound of the door closing subsided, the entire study suddenly turned quiet. It was as though it was isolated from the outside world. The beyonder powers of a baron of corruption? The distortion of door closing to seal the study? Very considerate. Klein pondered for a few seconds as he recalled the series of thoughts he had previously. Hence, he suddenly asked, February 6th. What did you do on Sunday evening? Flight Ken was taken aback as he said, We followed the revelation given by Mother Tree of Desire, and using the proliferation necklace and a hair obtained from a particular tramp, we held a ritual to magnify the tramp's gluttony. The tramp stand-in meant for Admiral Emirius was indeed killed by you. It was to prevent the Admiral from leaving and, hence, fall into a trap so that he can have sex with Cynthia and end up being corrupted? Klein instantly connected all the matters together. And my appearance provided another possibility that coincidentally destroyed this plan. Coincidence? That's not right. When the words coincidence flashed in his mind, Klein suddenly recalled the peculiarity of February 4th, the day the Mother Tree of Desire gave Flight Ken a dream revelation. It was the first day he arrived on Oravi Island. Chapter 631. 3 days of absence. Don't tell me that this matter was targeted at me? Klein was alarmed as he immediately became abnormally awake. As a person who had several similar experiences, he had quite a persecution complex. It really is possible. The Mother Tree of Desire used a dream to send Flight Ken a revelation just as I arrived at Oravi Island and began an entire series of plans. The first day I met Bilt Brando was the day the Naturism sect held the ritual to make the tramp stand-in die from gluttony. If they were targeting Admiral Emirius, the plan needed to ensure that there was no lack of a stand-in, and that he couldn't find an additional helper or other means to conceal his departure. But clearly, this is something that cannot be confirmed. My involvement is proof. If the target was me, then the previous problem is explained. Klein used his clown powers to control his facial expression as he gloomily looked at Flight Ken. With such a theory, more questions emerged in his mind. But how were they certain that Bilt Brando would seek me out? The news of Gehrman Sparrow being able to change into anyone was spread from Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy. It's an element beyond the Mother Tree of Desire's control. Of course, taking a different point of view, it's precisely due to the spreading of this news and my arrival in Oravi Island that made the Mother Tree of Desire send the revelation and put the plan into motion. But why would she want to corrupt me? My grudge with the Rose School of Thought hasn't reached the point of garnering the attention of an evil god. All I did was kill a Sequence 5 Wraith, a Sequence 6 Zombie, and a Sequence 7 Werewolf, with Miss Sharon and Merrick, snatching away the Scarlet Lunar Corona and biological poison bottle. My hunt against Admiral of Blood was terminated before it even started. It was an idea that didn't translate into action. The only thing that happened was the killing of Steel Mavedi. The act of revenge that resulted from this matter shouldn't even exceed the attention of a saint. Was it something special about me that resonated with some item formed by the aura of the Mother Tree of Desire on this island the moment I stepped onto it? But I've never faced any abnormal reactions from the holy artifacts left behind by other deities in Backlund or Tingen City. Furthermore, I did divine the matter above the grey fog and received the revelation that the death of the tramp was solely a coincidence. It wasn't arranged by a legendary creature or Grade 0 sealed artifact, but the outcome ended up different. This is the first time that divination above the grey fog has been disrupted in the true sense of the word? I didn't even notice that it had been disrupted? Klein's thoughts came to a pause as he discovered the most serious problem. Back when the matter involved 0-08, all he received was an ineffective revelation and not a disrupted outcome. Therefore, it's a power that exceeds a Grade 0 sealed artifact? The Mother Tree of Desire personally disrupted the matter, and she is a true deity herself? But it's very difficult for the 7 gods to influence the real world. There has to be a corresponding ritual. Yes, I had also divined the risks of acting as Emirius above the grey fog, and received a revelation saying that it was an acceptable risk. The outcome does match the development of the situation, so it wasn't disrupted? The more Klein thought about the matter, the more perplexed he became. What was most incomprehensible about it was that if the target of corruption was himself, why didn't he suffer any demanding trials, and he instead solved the problem in a relatively simple manner? This made the Mother Tree of Desire's arrangement appear like a joke. While pondering with this weight in mind, Klein nearly crushed Flight Ken. He asked again to verify his conjecture. To his surprise, the Naturism sect hadn't held any rituals to request the Mother Tree of Desire to disrupt any divination over the past week. They didn't make any special arrangements aimed towards the failure of the project. Strange. Klein took out a gold coin and flicked it as a final confirmation. Even without divination, he was almost certain that Flight Ken wasn't lying. Firstly, The man was already on the brink of a mental collapse, making him lack the ability to fabricate something reasonable. Secondly, Flight Ken's answers adhered to logic, completely confirming whatever Klein had deliberately kept to himself. The gold coin landed in his open palm, the king's portrait facing up, indicating a positive response. Combined with the divination statement, Klein finally confirmed that Flight Ken wasn't lying. After temporarily suppressing his puzzlement, he cast his gaze towards Flight Ken once again. He asked without a smile, "What deeds have you done in the past that violate the kingdom's laws or the moral fabric of society?" Flight Ken was taken aback for a few seconds as his mental state seemed to instantly turn for the better. From his point of view, his ploy against Admiral Emirius was the most serious crime, something that would most easily enrage this important figure. Everything else was trivial and nothing that needed a demigod to waste his time and energy on. Therefore, after skipping the important matters and coming to an ordinary topic, it meant that he might enjoy a good outcome. Flight Ken couldn't help but reveal a discreet smile as he hastened to recount. "I once tortured a family for an entire night for their property and abandoned them in the woods after murdering them. Then, I used fake documents and successfully obtained a sizable amount of wealth. I deliberately enticed many believers to indulge in their desires and watched as their emptiness and regret after the deed slowly paved the way for them to become fertilizer for the mother tree of desire. I once tricked many ladies to abide with their nature, an excuse for them to be redeemed by the spirits, allowing me to possess them. I tortured believers who attempted to renounce the religion, slicing off every part that protruded off their bodies." He recounted each and every sin of his, without any thoughts of concealing the truth. Klein felt disbelief with what he heard. He never expected anyone to be evil to this extent. As Flight Ken got increasingly excited from recounting his past deeds, he saw Admiral Emirius stand up without an expression before circling around the desk and standing in front of him. The Admiral then raised his left palm. A terrifying mouth appeared in the middle of the left palm, revealing 2 rows of illusory, white, and eerie teeth that were icy cold. "No, no." A sharp and horrified scream resounded in the room for a long time until silence prevailed. After a while, Klein bent down to pick up a blob of grayish-white light that resembled a shrunken brain. This was the beyonder characteristic of a lunatic. Unfortunately, Flight Ken had been searched before being brought here. He didn't leave behind any cash or items. Klein snapped his fingers and ignited the rest of the clothes. As he looked at his left shoulder, which was beginning its recovery process, he sat behind the desk and remained silent amidst the dancing scarlet flames. Once the traces were no longer noticeable, he pulled at a corresponding rope, making the bell outside ring. Luan released the restriction and entered, instinctively observing every corner. "Instruct the guards and the base personnel to cooperate with the Oravi police to do a cleanup of the Naturism sect. It's best if clues can be found and a number of Rose School of Thought members are caught." Klein solemnly gave the order. "Yes, Your Excellency," Luan answered respectfully. He didn't ask where Flight Ken was, as though the leader of the Naturism sect never existed. Klein didn't pay too much attention to the raid on Oravi Island. Using the excuse that he was slightly injured, he declined the remaining schedules for the next 2 days. This meant that he didn't need to worry about needing to exude the might of a high-sequence beyonder of the Arbiter pathway after expending the 9th law charm. Nearing noon, Luan entered after knocking the door and reported, "Your Excellency, Mr. Aston has yet to leave on the liner. The new Governor-General, Ben Conrad, has sent an invitation to participate in the banquet he's hosting tonight." Ben Conrad, the person who replaced Aston as Governor-General. According to what I know, Viscount Conrad's family is a loyal subject of the royal family. Talum likely got to know Prince Edisac while being the equestrian teacher of Viscount Conrad's youngest son. Klein nodded gently as he immersed himself in Emirius Revolt's complex emotions. He remained silent for a few seconds before saying, "Inform Governor-General Conrad that it's inconvenient for me to attend the banquet, because of the injuries suffered from the Naturism sect's assault. Apologize to him on my behalf." "Yes, Your Excellency." Luan didn't persuade him otherwise and calmly left the room. A demigod definitely had the right to be willful. As long as he didn't engage in some secret ploy or commit any serious mistake, there was no way he would be blamed regardless of what he did. This was because any faction would be willing to rope in a demigod. As he watched Luan's back vanish from the door, Klein shook his head indiscernibly and sat back behind the desk. A quiet day quickly passed. When it was almost midnight, Klein, who was sleeping in the guest room, suddenly woke up and sat up. His spiritual perception told him that someone had entered the house. Klein focused his gaze at the window and saw a middle-aged man in a tailcoat. He had black hair and blue eyes, with the corners of his mouth slightly sagging. He was none other than Admiral Amirius. Phew! He's finally back. Klein slowly stood up and cautiously asked, "What item did you give me before?" He was afraid that the Admiral Amirius before him was also a faceless in disguise. Admiral Amirius stood there and answered with a stern expression. "The 9th law charm." Without waiting for Gehrman Sparrow to speak again, he took 2 steps forward and calmly asked, "Did anything happen in the past few days?" Klein controlled his facial muscles and said, "Your secretary committed a mistake and was injured." "Oh, what else?" Admiral Amirius nodded with deep reservation. Klein tried hard not to move his gaze away as he looked straight at him and said, "Your younger brother has been relieved of his post as Governor-General. The new Governor-General has already taken over. Your Miss Cynthia mutated into a monster and was purified by me. A number of your bodyguards and attendants were infected to a certain extent and are currently receiving treatment." Amirius's expression turned into shock bit by bit in an uncontrollable manner. His eyes moved slightly, as though he suspected whether he had returned to the wrong place. It had only been 3 days. Chapter 632. Finishing up after a frozen moment of silence, Amirius quickly brought his expressions under control. He said in a domineering and deep tone, "Tell me the specifics." Klein didn't hide much of the truth. He began with Aston Revolt's question, before mentioning the warning from the mysterious person in the dream, and how he was told not to make a choice that resisted the trend of the times. Following that, he talked about the sudden telegram, and finally he spoke of Cynthia's mutation. He went into detail about the situation, the arrogance of the secretary, how he dealt with it, and the general investigations that followed. The only information he kept to himself was that the February 4th was the first day he arrived on Oravi Island, as well as his subsequent guesses. Of course, he was also very vague with matters regarding combat. He believed that Admiral Amirius was understanding enough. After all, what a Beyonder was good at or what unique abilities he had were one of their greatest secrets. If they were exposed or understood by others, it gave others a chance of setting up a targeted ambush, making it possible for them to die under the hands of an enemy of a lower sequence. Below that of high-sequence Beyonders, many Beyonders could be very powerful or very weak. After Amirius listened to the recount in silence, his expression didn't seem to change in the dark room. However, the fact that he hadn't interrupted Klein's recount implied something. After a few seconds of silence, he asked in a deep voice, "The mysterious person who infiltrated your dream emphasized the fate of an era, as well as the trend of the times?" "Yes." Klein had already changed back into Gehrman Sparrow's appearance. He didn't deliberately go into detail that the mysterious person had never mentioned Aston Revolt's exact plan. Amirius fell silent again. "You maintained my appearance in your dream?" "Yes, this is my secret," Klein answered succinctly. Amirius nodded indiscernibly as he paced around in a tiny area before looking back at Gehrman Sparrow. "There were no problems with your choices." Upon hearing this, Klein seemed to receive the ultimate and most effective feedback. A large portion of the potion in him was digested as a result. Amidst the deep reverberating tone, Amirius turned his body to the side and said without any hint of emotion, "I originally had no plans to have a contract with the stand-in, and instead I wanted to inform Cynthia that I had the symptoms of losing control, making it impossible for me to have any physical relationship with her for 5 days. However, I later changed my mind due to certain reasons. If not for the temporary contract's forceful restriction, even if I'm able to withstand the temptations during usual times, I might not have been able to resist the magnified desires last night. Of course, if Cynthia knew of the 5-day restriction ahead of time, she wouldn't be in such a rush to consume the powder ground from the proliferation necklace. It would have prevented her from sensing the mother tree of desire and end up mutating. But as such, the ball is in the naturism sex court. They could have made up an excuse to get Cynthia to consume it. This matter was really targeted at me. What does the mother tree of desire actually want? Also, what was the reason that caused Admiral Amirius to make such an important change? Klein seemed to grasp the crux of the matter as he looked at Amirius's side profile. "What's the reason?" Amirius said with a deadpan expression. "There's no need for you to know." For the first time in his life, Klein hated such a response. After some thought, he took out the cracked pendant and threw it at Amirius. "This is the proliferation necklace that originated from the mother tree of desire." Amirius raised his hand to catch it before looking down. "You may leave." Go to Built to receive your reward. Aren't you worried that I know of something I'm not supposed to know? That's right. Aston's ploy has been exposed and is known by his political enemies. As for Emirius, he was clearly not involved. Therefore, it doesn't matter if I understand anything. Klein imagined that there would be a long-term confidential contract, but to his surprise, he could leave just like that. Noticing that Emirius didn't raise another matter, he pointed at him and said, "Clothes." Only then did Admiral Emirius look up, silently taking off the formal attire comprised of a shirt and tailcoat. Klein had originally wished to ask for additional payment due to the excessive dangers that went beyond the scope of the original agreement. But after secretly confirming that Cynthia's outcome was because of him, he abandoned the idea while feeling guilty. He quickly took off the comfortable sleeping robe, switched into a tailcoat, and under Emirius's guidance, leaped out of the window, and secretly left the garden villa while the bodyguard's eyes were confounded. Emirius donned a sleeping robe and clenched the proliferation necklace before walking to the window. He stood there silently as he faced the crimson moon and few stars in the dark night. He stood there without an expression, not even changing his posture for a long period of time. Pah! He slightly relaxed his clenched fist as the miniaturized rhinoceros horn fell to the ground in the form of shattered pieces, bit by bit, fragment by fragment. The next day at noon, Klein, who had slept soundly the entire night, left the inn and took a carriage to Sweet Lemon Bar. He went to the second floor to meet Built Brando. "It's over?" Built asked with relief and surprise. Klein nodded and said, "Admiral Emirius has returned. Where's the rest of the payment?" Built revealed an unconcealable smile. After he dismissed his guards, he personally went to a safe and took out the remaining £500 and a blue cufflink. "This is the mystical item created from the Murloc bladder you provided," Built introduced. "It can provide illusory scales hidden beneath the skin, so you will be as difficult to catch as a fish. It will also help withstand a certain level of damage for you. With it, you can dive to at least 15 meters without any protective gear. You can freely move about in the water for 10 minutes. It doesn't have any serious negative effects. It will just make you tired easily when in a hot or arid place. That means this cufflink shouldn't be used with the sun brooch." Klein extended his hand to collect the money and item. "Aren't you afraid that there will be problems?" Built cracked a joke. "Your business is here," Klein answered calmly. His meaning was clear. If there were any problems, he wasn't afraid that the person in charge would go missing. Built's smile froze as he said, "It hasn't been named. You can give it one." Murloc cufflink. Klein couldn't be bothered to waste his brain cells. "Nice name. It leaves quite an impression," Built said with a forced smile. He paused for a moment before saying, "That artisan said that he can fix the summoning ritual of a spirit world creature onto materials with spirituality. It will be able to last a maximum of 1.5 years, but you will need to provide detailed information. Heh, according to our agreement, I'll be responsible for it, so there's nothing to be worried about." "All right. Make it a harmonica." Klein took out a pen and paper from his pocket and scribbled the ritual to summon his messenger. "Messenger? This is rather rare. It's very hard for Beyonders not from the death pathway to find a suitable one." Built received the piece of paper and casually scanned it. If the messenger is accidentally summoned during the production process, a gold coin has to be given to her. What happens if it's not given? Spirit world creatures always have something odd about them. I've seen some who love music, as well as ones who loiter around shit. What happens if you don't give one? Perhaps Ma'am Rionette Tinker might bring the heads of you and the artisan to me. She's a creature with a castle in the spirit world. She might even be stronger than me. Well, under situations when I'm not using the sea god's scepter. Klein lampooned as he said in a deep voice, "The third promised item can be left to the future." "All right." Built didn't have any objections. Following that, he asked out of curiosity, "Mr. Gehrman, how did you fool Secretary Luan, Governor General Aston, and Miss Cynthia? People who Admiral Emirius specifically mentioned?" Klein did his best to prevent his facial muscles from twitching. "Follow the information and think about it carefully." He didn't provide an exact description before he stood up and bowed with his hat. "It's time I bid farewell." "It was a pleasure working with you," Built answered with a smile. After watching Gehrman Sparrow's figure vanish behind the door, he shook his head and chuckled, muttering, "This powerful and crazy adventurer is actually a natural actor?" After lunch, his subordinate sent him the day's papers. As Built sucked on a cigar, He flipped through it when his expression suddenly froze. Last night, the new Governor-General, Ben Conrad, held a banquet. New Governor-General? Aston Revolt has been relieved of his position as Governor-General? Bilt picked up the other sets of newspapers and found the same piece of information. With his connections in Oravi, he should have long heard of news regarding a replacement of the Governor-General. However, the replacement was extremely sudden. Most people only learned of the situation when the new Governor-General officially made his appearance. After a while, a partner who was secretly serving Admiral Emirius entered the room. Your Excellency wants you to investigate the people around you for Naturism sect believers and sink them all into the sea. The partner passed on Emirius's instructions. All right. Bilt asked curiously, what exactly happened? The Naturism sect suffered a terrible blow since yesterday. His Excellency suffered an assassination attempt from the Naturism sect yesterday. Miss Cynthia perished as a result. Secretary Luan was injured, and the Admiral lost many of his bodyguards. The partner described simply. Bilt was momentarily stunned. Aren't these the people Admiral Emirius mentioned to be careful of when acting in front of them? I even specially emphasized it to Gehrman Sparrow. Now, Miss Cynthia is dead, Secretary Luan is injured, and Aston Revolt has been relieved of his position as Governor-General. The corners of Bilt's mouth twitched while he wore a blank expression. East Chester County, Stone City. Audrey silently listened to a noble lady's words, echoing her from time to time as she provided an ear to listen to. Towards the end, the noble lady praised her sincerely. Audrey, you really are an angel. I feel a lot more comfortable after chatting with you. At this moment, Audrey saw the female priest from the Church of Evernight enter. Hence, she exchanged pleasantries before walking over with a smile. This priest appeared ordinary, as she only provided low-level preachings, but in fact, she was a secret member of the Psychology Alchemists. Audrey, the potion formula is already in my hands. However, you need to contribute enough to obtain it, the female priest whispered while no one was paying attention. Audrey's eyes darted around slightly as she said, that wouldn't be an issue. However, ma'am Smine, can you tell me its name? The female priest looked around before saying with a suppressed voice, Hypnotist. Chapter 633. 2 types of parasitizing. After leaving the Sweet Lemon Bar, Klein directly returned to his inn. Just as he was packing his luggage, the gigantic skeleton messenger appeared suddenly. It originally wanted to pat Klein on the shoulder, but it failed due to its nearly 4-meter-tall body with its head penetrating through the ceiling. All it could do was throw the letter ahead before collapsing into nothingness. Mr. Azik has finally replied. It has almost been a week. Has the messenger been changed? It looks like the original one and would make the corresponding warning. Klein caught the letter and unfolded it. I'm very sorry that I'm only replying to you today. Perhaps it's because the memories I've recovered has exceeded the limits of my body. I had to spend several days in a deep sleep to adapt to it. The matters you described does coincide with the traits of a marauder pathway. Their corresponding sequence 4 is parasite. In higher sequences, they possess the beyonder powers of parasitized bodies. According to what I know, there are 2 types of parasitizing. The first type is a preliminary state. The parasite would borrow the host's body to hide himself, so as to extend his lifespan and recover from his injuries. He can see and hear whatever the host sees and hears, but he is unable to interfere with the host's thoughts or steal his thoughts. Therefore, for a host to converse with a parasite, he will have to be the first to speak. The other is full control. The parasite is nearly fused with the host's spirit body, knowing and understanding his thoughts, as well as take over control of the body. Faced against the first type of parasite, one can inform the host via dreams or a subconscious conversation without worrying about being discovered by the parasite. This is because the parasite has to use the host's senses to sense his surroundings. For the second state, there is no way to converse with the host without the parasite's knowledge. However, there is a chance of eradicating the parasite, which is to rely on the host's faith. It's very difficult for me to accurately describe such matters, and all I can say is that when one opens his heart while praying, the target of the prayer would be able to discover the existence of the parasite, and through a particular ritual, provide feedback to complete the separation or eradication. Of course, the prerequisite is that the host himself doesn't know of this. Otherwise, the parasite would definitely be alerted and begin carrying out preventive measures. Isn't the latter situation somewhat similar to Little Sun's? He prayed to me without much thought, and I discovered the existence of Amon's avatar. Then with a concealed goal, I taught him the secret deed ritual and used it to cleanse the parasite. Klein instantly had a deeper understanding of the previous situation he was in. However, I'm currently unable to determine which state my dear poet is in. Back in Tingen, he would occasionally talk to himself. This might be a result of the first type of parasitic states, but the problem lies in the fact that it has been months. It's possible that the parasite has completed his complete control of Leonard. I have to first confirm the matter before knowing what I should do. Otherwise, rashly entering his dream will only lead to preemptively warning the parasite, making the problem more serious and harder to resolve. If it's the second parasitic state, my dear poet believes the goddess, but she has millions of believers. It's unlikely that she would pay important notice to a red glove who's neither a blessed or saint. She's unlike me, the fool. I read every prayer and often provide a one-to-one service. This is what it's like during a startup phase. As Klein thought over it, he suddenly sighed and felt wistful. He originally planned on entrusting a task to Emlyn to secretly monitor Leonard Mitchell to see if he often whispered to himself. However, after considering how Emlyn had already appeared before Leonard and the parasite because of Tinder, there was a high chance that he was a target they were wary of or a target of investigation. Therefore, he rationally abandoned such a thought. Miss Magician is only a sequence 8 and a trick master. She doesn't have the ability to monitor a parasite at the angel level or a red glove. Miss Justice's identity is the best form of concealment. Besides, she's also a believer of the goddess. But the problem lies in the fact that she's back in her fief. She will only return to Backlund in June. Mr. Hanged Man and Ma'am Hermit are at sea. As for Little Son, there's no way for him to connect with the outside world. There's still not enough Tarot Club members. The factions they've expanded into are still lacking. I can't find any suitable person to help me complete this task. Among the people I know, Miss Sharon should be the best choice to perform such matters when it comes to concealment, but I have no way of contacting her, even if I do it through Miss Magician or Emlyn. Sigh, I had fled Backlund in a hurry, so I failed to consider many of the consequences. Klein raised his hand to knead his temples as he thought about how Leonard was an elite red glove in the Nighthawks. There were high-ranking deacons in the church watching over him, so it was unlikely the parasite would dare to do anything for now. Hence, he decided to put the matter aside and wait for a more suitable helper. Perhaps I can wait until I digest the potion and head east of the Sonia Sea to find mermaids. After I complete my advancement, I can return to Backlund and do it myself. The experienced Klein didn't hesitate further as he rapidly made up his mind. Inside Sweet Lemon Bar. After the uneasy Bilt handled 2 Naturism sect believers among his close aides, he finally received some good news. Are you telling me that Admiral Emirius will be returning to Byam today? He stood up with a cigar in hand. Sothith nodded gently and said, his fleet left the harbor half an hour ago. It's steering towards the Rorstad archipelago. Phew. Bilt didn't conceal his sigh of relief, having confirmed that the Admiral wasn't putting any blame on him. Just the thought of how Gehrman Sparrow had managed to make the Admiral suffer the loss of so many of his bodyguards, the younger brother's loss of his position as Governor-General, the injury of his secretary, and the death of his mistress, he couldn't help but wonder about his own management capabilities. Although the responsibility of these matters wasn't necessarily Gehrman Sparrow's fault, to have them all happen at once had made one believe that it was the crazy adventurer's fault. At the very least, he was unlucky enough. And as his employer and endorser, Bilt believed that there was no way he could escape responsibility. He definitely needed to incur punishment from Admiral Emirius. His Excellency is indeed a demigod. He didn't let his rage blind his reason. Praise the Lord. May the storm be with us, Bilt said as he struck his right fist on his left breast. At this moment, the subordinates he sent rushed back. Boss, Gehrman Sparrow has disappeared. The subordinate reported in a hurried tone. Bilt frowned slightly. Disappeared? Yes. After he checked out of his room, he held his suitcase and circled the area several times before disappearing. The subordinate explained truthfully. It's really difficult to monitor an adventurer who can shapeshift into anyone. Bilt sighed and said, leave it. There's no need to seek him out again. After being targeted by the Mother Tree of Desire, Klein cautiously changed his appearance and identity, as well as his place of residence to prevent anyone from targeting him. From the feedback received from acting as Admiral Emirius, he decided to quickly digest the potion by putting it into practice. While riding a carriage to the Oravi Hospice Foundation, Klein once again stepped in. The person in charge of the registration was still Ma'am Joanna. She looked up and asked, "You want to do volunteer work?" "Yes." Klein nodded seriously. Joanna took out a form and asked like clockwork, "Name?" Klein smiled and replied, "Sinbad Volunteer." The weather in Eastchester County during April was comfortable. The vegetation was lush and the scenery was beautiful. It was the perfect season for hunting. Audrey was dressed in a waist-fitting black riding suit with a helmet. She was on a burgundy mare that belonged to her, while in pursuit of a brightly colored wild chicken. She shot a whistling arrow and accurately struck the prey. As a psychiatrist, her physical attributes had clearly been enhanced. Together with her education in archery from a young age, whether it was in shooting firearms or in archery, she was considered rather skilled. A golden figure pounced forward and rapidly bit onto the prey which had lost its life. It was none other than Susie. "It's a pleasure working with you." The corners of Audrey's lips curled up as she struck her palm with Susie's paw with a smile. At this moment, the aristocrats surrounding her came over, either praising her for her hunting prowess or her training of her hunting hound. Audrey felt a little ashamed regarding the latter half. She had never trained Susie before. The aristocrats quickly dispersed as they continued chasing their prey. As for the low-level priest of the Evernight goddess, she came over and said to Audrey with a suppressed voice, "You can receive the hypnotist formula after completing the final mission." Finally. Audrey's eyes lit up as she silently nodded. To be frank, if she were still the green and squeamish noble lady of the past, she would have long lost the patience to accumulate the required contributions and would have ended up requesting the purchase of the hypnotist potion formula at the Tarot Club. But she knew very well that building up contributions would aid her infiltration into the psychology alchemists. She would be more trusted and build up a good foundation for her to receive the high-sequence potion formulas in the future. Therefore, she patiently performed matters that were either uninteresting or interesting. Of course, Audrey didn't waste the past 2 months. She had been eavesdropping on the conversations of the aristocrats and maidservants, before guiding them to pour out their frustrations and aid them in defeating their negative emotions. This allowed her to act as a psychiatrist very perfectly. During this process, she realized that she would unknowingly eavesdrop, observe, and steer the people around her, to understand their flaws and habitual thought processes. She believed that she could disadvantage or mentally break any one of them without leaving a mark. She could also get them to help her by their own will without them even realizing it. It has to be said that it's actually quite terrifying, just like monsters in the legends, who can grasp your minds. As she recalled, Audrey couldn't help but sigh inwardly. Smine was somewhat unaccustomed to horse riding as she carefully circled the area and said, "Stone University's Associate Professor Michelle is a collector. We wish for you to purchase a notebook from the 20-Year War." The 20-Year War referred to a war between the Lone Kingdom and Feysac Empire in the 5th Epoch's year 621 to 642. The former was defeated and lost the ancient Elves Island, which was present-day Sonia Island. Chapter 634. City of Whitestone University. Professor Michelle. Notebook from the 20-Year War era. Audrey extracted the key terms in the words and glanced at Susie, who was running happily in front of the mare. She went straight to the point by asking, "Ma'am Smine, what kind of notebook is it?" "I'm not sure. All I know is that it belongs to the period of the 20-Year War. It's part of Associate Professor Michelle's collection. It has an important characteristic. The patterns on the cover faintly forms a dragon." Smine didn't hide it from Audrey as she told her all the information she knew. Audrey, who silently listened to her descriptions, restrained her burgundy mare as she considered how she could complete the mission. Visit Associate Professor Michelle and view his collections before raising a request to buy one of the items isn't too difficult. Although it's embarrassing to admit this, it's quite unlikely he would reject me regardless of the way it's said. Yes, Audrey, you shouldn't be overly reliant on these. The biggest problem is being out of the blue. I didn't know Associate Professor Michelle before this, making it very difficult to explain why I'm suddenly visiting him. Besides, I don't know what the notebook means to him. Announcing my desire to purchase it might result in him being alert and wary. Jen's elder brother is studying at Stone University. At the last gathering, he depicted his penchant for describing and discussing matters. If I were to invite him and his sister to the next afternoon tea and steer the topic towards history, archaeology, or collections, then he will likely mention Associate Professor Michelle. Yes, at a university, there's definitely not many people who can be called collectors. With such a precursor, I can send someone to pay a visit to Associate Professor Michel and make the request to view his collection. At the first meeting, I'll try my best not to show my desire for it. I'll observe the owner's actions and guide him to reveal his true self. This will be helpful for me to use suitable matters for suitable requests at a suitable time. After confirming her line of thought, Audrey nodded at Smine and smiled. I'll work hard to complete the mission, but I can't guarantee success. Just as she said that, she tightened the girth before shooting forward like an arrow, heading straight for a reddish-brown fox that was darting around in a hunting encirclement. Above the tumultuous sea, the Blue Avenger was like a leaf tumbling amidst heavy squalls. From time to time, it would be thrown up before crashing back into the waves, but it maintained a stunning sense of balance without any signs of capsizing. Inside the captain's cabin, Alger Wilson was floating around the window as he looked at the waves outside, which were as high as mountains. There were forceful winds blowing around him in silence. Some time later, he landed his feet onto the carpet. Wind Blessed is indeed a sequence that can be easily acted based on its name. The only problem is that it occasionally makes me irascible, completely matching the characteristics of a gale. Alger sighed inwardly without any delight. Over the past 2 months or so, he had failed to obtain the Ocean Songster formula through his own resource channels and the Tarot Club's trades. After all, it was that of a sequence 5, the sequence closest to a demigod. The corresponding formula was already something where demand far outstripped supply. Even with boatloads of money and the willingness to pay a premium, it was very difficult to buy one. Normally speaking, joining the corresponding church or organization was the most effective method of obtaining the corresponding formula. But as a Church of Storm's bishop, Alger was unable to rely on this method. Due to particular secrets, he needed to hide his strength in order to win the freedom he needed to take action and be under light monitoring. Only after he had sufficient confidence would he head for a place and complete the goal he had been waiting for all this time. To his joy, he didn't waste the past 2 months. At the very least, the speed at which he digested the Wind-Blessed potion was pretty decent. The Wind-Blessed is simple. Ocean Songster is said to be quite difficult. Must I frequently sing? Alger couldn't help but turn his head and look towards the deck. Although he was separated from them by several rooms, he could still hear the drunken sailors singing with gusto, creating a din that could rival the storm's roars. Alger unknowingly frowned. Backlund. Cherwood Borough. Synthus Circus. Ma'am, didn't you say that you're performing magic? Why are you dressed like that? A youth asked the woman dressed in a pitch-black pointed hat and dress of the same color in puzzlement. I don't know why I'm wearing this as well. Perhaps it's because of my first appearance here. My brain was freezing from the weather and my style was subsequently fixed. Furs rubbed her face, which had red and yellow paint, as she replied with a smile. In ancient times, magic is often mistaken as witchcraft. But this has nothing to do with why I'm wearing this. She picked up the middle of 3 porcelain cups which were placed in front of her. She then placed a white ball beneath it. Then, she quickly switched the positions of the cups before smiling at the youth who had questioned her. Guess where the tiny ball is? Isn't this one of the gambling methods invented by Emperor Roselle? The youth said with piqued interest. But you aren't a croupier, but a trick master at a circus. Therefore, I believe that the ball has already been switched away. All the cups are empty. Furs smiled and said, Congratulations, you got it wrong. She suddenly picked up the cup in the middle as a white blur flew out. It was a dove. As for the tiny ball from before, it was where the dove had left. Wow! Godly! Wonderful magic! Brilliant! After a series of amazed exclamations, Furs clearly looked pleased with herself as she looked at the distant cathedral bell, put away her props, and returned to the tent where the circus master resided. Are you really resigning? I can double your salary. The circus master came over as he tried to persuade her otherwise. Unfortunately, I had already summarized the trickmaster principles by the middle of March and had already completely digested the potion last week. If it wasn't because the contract ended today, I wouldn't even be here today. Although being a trickmaster feels very nice, this doesn't stop me from my goal of advancing to astrologer. Teacher said that he would be giving me the formula, ingredients, and a gift this week. What kind of gift will it be? Sigh, the ravings from the full moon are getting more terrifying. If not for Mr. Fool, I definitely would have lost control and become a monster. Furs extended her right hand and covered her mouth, languidly yawning. Then she said with a smile, Well, I'm actually a best-selling author. My next book is related to circuses, so I came here to be hired. A best-selling author? The circus master's eyes lit up as he said worriedly and expectantly, "Will you write bad things about us? Are there any? I had a great time for the past 2 months." Furs took off her pointed black hat. The circus master revealed a sincere smile and said, "Wall, ma'am Wall, can you mention our circus's name in your book? I'll pay you advertisement fees. Of course, it won't be much. As you know, I'm responsible for the livelihoods of many people." "That can be done?" This circus master is quite smart. For the first time, Furs realized that a novel could advertise, just like in newspapers or magazines. Furthermore, the format was more obscure and natural. Amidst waves, a liner with rows of cannons traveled along a safe sea route without daring to deviate far from it. Any deviation from the sea route east of Oravi Island usually meant disappearing. Even pirates didn't dare to stray too far from the safe zones. This sea was filled with unexplored regions, filled with all sorts of sensational legends. After 2 months of volunteer work and finding 4 chances to engage in true acting, Klein bade farewell to carrying patients, scrubbing toilet bowls, cleaning vomit, and other miscellaneous chores. He boarded a ship headed for the Gargas archipelago. At the tarot gathering in early March, he had hired the hermit Katlia in a private conversation. He would meet her at the capital of Gargas archipelago, the city of White, Naz. He would then board her ship and head for the dangerous ocean, which was close to an illusion, on the far east of the Sonia Sea. There, he would search for unaffiliated mermaids who lived there. The hermit Katlia seemed to be very interested in meeting members of the tarot club in the real world. With just a few seconds of thought, she agreed to the world's request. However, due to the high level of danger, she had given a high asking price. £3,000. Klein's first reaction was to give up and take Mr. Hangedman's ghost ship, but considering how there would be many sailors from the Church of Storms following him, making his freedom limited, and the fact that the level of danger in the easternmost area of the Sonia Sea was high, he finally accepted Ma'am Hermit's condition. As for her, she would wait around the Gargas archipelago for a month at the beginning of April. Any delay would imply the end of the cooperation. To not waste the £1,000 deposit, Klein didn't wait to complete his digestion before heading for Gargas archipelago from Oravi Island. Of course, with the summaries and chances at true acting from before, he was already very close to completely digesting the faceless potion. Even if he didn't use true acting, just acting in his capacity as Gehrman Sparrow was enough to complete the digestion in 2 to 3 weeks. Due to this reason, as well as the world's identity being tied with Gehrman Sparrow, Klein transformed back into the lunatic and powerful adventurer once he left the hospital. However, he did disguise himself to a certain degree. As he watched the perturbed sea surface, Klein finally saw a port city that had houses mainly made of white rock. The most eastern front of the Faysac Empire, the capital of the Gargas archipelago, Naz. "I'm finally overseas." Klein looked at a fishing boat carrying whale meat cruising into the harbor. Its ruggedness wasn't concealed. Meanwhile, he discovered several ships hanging pirate flags docked at the harbor without any signs of concealment. Indeed, Oravi Island's eastern front is a playground for pirates. Klein wore his hat and carried his luggage and left the cabin after the liner came to a stable halt. He went down the gangway into the harbor. After a few steps, he saw a crew of pirates seemingly entering conflict with a local gang. Both sides drew their weapons as they clashed. Klein calmly walked past, showing no signs of stopping them. At that moment, he saw a local pull out a few cans from his pocket and opened the lid before throwing it into the middle of the road. "What's the meaning of this?" Klein nearly laughed out before recalling an infamous item at sea. Canned wolf fish. Canned wolf fish was popular on the east coast of Faysac and the Gargas archipelago. Just as the thought surfaced, an indescribable stench seemed to inundate Klein's olfactory senses. His facial muscles twitched as he tried hard to resist his body's discomfort as he quickly left the region. A small number of pirates who were struck by the stench vomited immediately, while the remaining ones frantically fled while dragging their companions as though they had lost all their combat strength. A minute later, in a secluded corner, the crazy adventurer, Gehrman Sparrow, crouched down and silently belched. Chapter 635. Meeting the smell of canned wolf fish is really pungent. Not only is it smelly, but it's also disgusting. It's practically a biological weapon. Klein crouched in the corner and took nearly a minute to recover. Before that very instant, he had underestimated canned wolf fish. He had failed to take the necessary actions to deal with the situation. He could have used paper figurine substitutes or create an invisible air tube to pretend that he was using underwater breathing, but he had done none of that. Now, he finally got a deep understanding of how wise it was to ban opening canned wolffish in public. Phew. Klein exhaled as he slowly stood up. Carrying his suitcase, he slowly walked towards the harbor. His first impression of the city named Nas was one of many white houses, with stone being a common material for the buildings. The second impression was that it wasn't too far north, but the temperature was rather cold. Even though it was already April, it was still only a few degrees Celsius. The third impression was that there were many whaling houses. Gigantic beluga whales were being dismembered for their skin, flesh, fat, bones, and gray amber. The latter two could be used to make pannier for banquet dresses or top-grade scented materials. Whether it was for incense or perfume, they were considered luxurious goods that only the wealthy and nobles could enjoy. As for the skin, flesh, and fat of beluga whales, they also had their own uses. They were used separately to make clothes, food, or oil-related products. In Nas and the Gargas archipelago, the culinary methods for preparing beluga whale had transformed into a unique culture. There were all sorts of techniques in famous restaurants. Klein passed by the various whaling houses, seeing separated fat being carried out on cargo carriages towards nearby factories that spewed black smoke. They were oil refineries which were very unique to Gargas. Beluga whale fat could be refined into whale oil, which could be bottled and made into outstanding incendiary material and the lifeblood of particular industries. Very unique. Klein exhaled some mist as he stopped and watched for a while. Out of the harbor and into the city district, a cacophony of Fey Sac inundated his ears. Having mastered ancient Fey Sac, the source of the northern continent's language, Klein was long familiar with the language of the northern continent barbarians. He turned his head upon hearing the din and saw the tall populace with slightly blonde hair raising horizontal banners as they protested on the streets. The horizontal banner right at the front clearly wrote the reasons for their protest. Oppose the poaching of beluga whales. We need sustainable development. Klein nearly lost his cool as he believed that the concept of sustainable development was highly likely to be invented by Emperor Roselle. As he swept his gaze, he looked at the banners behind it and understood the goals of the protest. Whaling for survival, not entertainment. Humans aren't more important than beluga whales. Greedy devils should leave Nas. At this moment, a policeman dressed in a gray uniform held a shield, riot fork, and baton to stop the protesters from advancing. After a brief argument, the scene quickly turned violent. Many protesting youths threw opened canned wolffish, as well as Molotov cocktails. The police didn't show restraint as they forged forward, raising their shields and striking with their batons. Klein pinched his nose as he watched the fire burning on the street. He realized that many passers-by were completely unfazed. Apart from a small bunch of spectators, the rest continued proceeding to their destinations. It appears that such things happen often in Nas. Do protests develop into riots? As expected of the Fey Sac Empire, Klein mumbled to himself, circled the street, and casually found an inn to stay. He continued registering as Gairman Sparrow, unworried that the news released by Vice Admiral Aylmont Tracy would cause the Church of the Evernight Goddess to view him as a faceless. This was because he had no plans on traveling through the whale fishing routes to find mermaids who were believers of the goddess. He planned on heading to the dangerous region farthest east from the Sonia Sea. As for the safety in the Gargas archipelago, there was nothing he needed to worry about. This was a colony of the Fey Sac Empire. The only legal church was the Church of the God of Combat. They were enemies with the Church of the Evernight Goddess. Klein was originally worried that he would encounter many faceless here, meeting 7 or 8 faceless simply from going next door to enjoy some whale cuisine. However, after serious consideration, he rationally eliminated this possibility. First, Beyonders from the Seer pathway were rare to begin with. Klein had only met 3 Beyonders who were beyond Sequence 8. And second, Sequence 6 Beyonders weren't commonly seen. Even in a playground for pirates, those who had 5,000-pound bounties were considered rare creatures. Third, once a faceless had many preparations, they would seek out mermaids on a whaling boat. They would either begin having faith in the goddess, sink to the bottom of the ocean, or become research personnel. Otherwise, the extremely smart ones would seize the opportunity and successfully advance before leaving safely. It was very rare for them to stay on Gargas Archipelago for long. In all of Nas, excluding myself, there wouldn't be more than 2 faceless. Klein straightened his clothes as he wasn't in a rush to contact Admiral of Stars Katlia.
He came onto the streets in a good mood and began searching for delicacies according to what he heard on his travels.
Raw beluga whale slices, fried whale steak, whale oil with skin, roasted whale meat. Like a standard traveler, Klein restaurant hopped thrice and sampled different food. Not bad. It's pretty unique and it's not very fishy. Instead, it's very appetizing and alluring. Burp. Klein covered his mouth as he came onto the streets. He discovered that the street lamps were sparse, but the lights from the houses lining the streets were bright. To a certain extent, they reduced the darkness of the night. Ice-cold winds passed through the ocean, causing Klein to raise his hand to prop up his collar. The blue cufflinks had their lusters restrained as they were deeply embedded at his wrists. Compared to rings, items like cufflinks were more suited to Gehrman Sparrow's persona. Therefore, Klein didn't blame the artisan for making changes without his permission. As for the harmonica that had fixed the summoning ritual of a spirit world creature, it matched Klein's inward intentions completely. It could be used for a year and a half. It was silver in color, exquisite and beautiful. When he received the harmonica, Klein had imagined such a scene, a crazy and powerful adventurer playing a sad tune on the harmonica in a silent night under the dark moonlight by the side of a boat. Unfortunately, the harmonica couldn't produce any sound, and it could only be used to summon Rionette Tinker. Shaking his head indiscernibly, Klein steadily walked down the empty and cold Nas streets before returning to his inn. Using sleep to bring himself back to an optimal state, he went to Grey Amber Street the next morning and entered a sundry store named Hot Whale Dance. Upon seeing the grizzled boss who was a head taller than him, Klein tapped the counter and said in Faceac whale oil. The boss had wrinkles plastered across his face, but he only wore a coat made of beluga whale skin. The light-colored patterns had a strange beauty. How much? The boss was drinking large mouthfuls of liquor, ignoring the messy placement of the goods. 1¼ buckets, Klein replied according to the predetermined secret password. The boss's drinking actions instantly slowed down as he placed the cup of brownish-green alcohol onto the bar counter. Do you want to try some? It's many times purer than Nepos. It's considered the mistress of all Faceac men. This was a distilled liquor that's a specialty of Faceac. It's brewed with potatoes or grain. The alcohol purity was high, as stimulating and famous as Blaze. Compared to Sonia blood wine, its price was rather low, and it was well liked by ordinary Faceacians. There's no need. Klein shook his head. The boss chuckled. What kind of man are you if you don't drink Nepos? Are there only women in Lone? He mumbled before drinking another mouthful. Who introduced you here? Ma'am Gurmises, Klein said a name in the style of the local customs. The boss exhaled, causing a strong scent of distilled liquor to linger in the air. He staggered as he got up, like a polar bear performing at a circus. After giving the store employee instructions, he brought Klein to a tiny room on the second story of the warehouse at the back. Let me search for it. Let's see, the boss mumbled as he crouched. Klein controlled the twitching of his facial muscles as he recalled a widely spread joke in the Lone Kingdom. When is a Faceac man not drunk? When he's in his mother's womb. After waiting for a moment, Klein saw the boss find a pure crystal ball from his rummaging. Then the tipsy polar bear had his back facing Klein as he rubbed his hands on it, softly chanting the tongue-twisting ancient Hermes. The room gradually turned dark as all the corners without light sank like they were producing a strange attractive force. The crystal ball quickly lit up, producing the figure of a woman wearing a black, classic robe. She had an oval face and had very fair skin. Her eyes were deep black with a slight purple hue which was filled with mystery. I'm seeing another Tarot Club member's actual appearance again. Klein stepped forward and received the crystal ball. On the opposite end of the crystal ball, the hermit Katlia could also clearly see the world. He had black hair and brown eyes, with a thin and angular face. Her gaze paused for a moment before she hesitantly said, Gehrman Sparrow? She discovered that the true strength and standards of the Tarot Club members were far stronger than she had expected. The world was actually the crazy hunter, Gehrman Sparrow, who was considered at the level of a pirate admiral. My various assumptions of the world were problematic. Controlled, staid, experienced, and ruthless. Admiral of Stars didn't feel overly surprised. Yes, Ma'am Katlia. Klein gestured for the boss to leave the room. After it became extremely quiet, Admiral of Stars Katlia asked once again, I'm very curious. How did you recognize my identity? I've been very careful when participating in the gatherings. Of course, she had jumped in fright when the world, who had chosen to speak privately with her, immediately greeted her with Admiral of Stars. And it was partly because of this that she chose to take on the world's commission. A secret. Klein smiled politely.
As he didn't wish for her to make connections to Mr. Fool, he calmly added, "Your eyes are very special."
Can I understand that as a form of praise? Katlia smiled, feeling somewhat enlightened.
She believed that the world had previously only relied on her eyes and other details to suspect that she was Admiral of Stars, but she wasn't certain.
Hence, he had probed her with language, and her reaction told him the correct answer. Klein didn't respond as he switched to asking, "When can we set off?" Chapter 636. Slaughterer Admiral of Stars. Katlia thought before answering, "Tonight at 8. Dock 6. Not bad. There's no delay at all." Klein nodded slightly. "Okay."
Just as he said that, the light inside the crystal ball suddenly converged as the figure dressed in a black, classic robe darkened and blurred before quickly vanishing.
Holding the crystal ball which had turned very ordinary, Klein turned around, pulled open the door and walked out. Glancing at the boss who was guzzling alcohol while leaning against a wall, he threw the crystal ball at him. The boss fumbled to catch it as Klein unhurriedly walked down the stairs and left the warehouse. Once he was out of Hot Whale Dance, he took out his golden pocket watch and snapped it open to check the time. It's almost noon. Most bars will be open. Klein stopped a rental carriage and used Faceac to tell the driver to head to the Lardle Bar. It meant Dawn Bar in the local language. It was a place where adventurers would gather in the Gargas archipelago. To Klein, the gathering of different intel and news was meaningful. This might aid him in making the best judgment at critical points in time, allowing him to escape the misfortune of losing his life. Therefore, even if he didn't like bars, he often went there.
He would get a cup of thick malt beer and silently sit in the corner of the bar counter and listen to any matters of interest which people mentioned at sea.
In addition, he wanted to know about Roy King, who had been imprisoned in Byam's Governor-General's office. Over the past 2 months, Snake of Mercury Willa Septon hadn't sent him any dreams. Similarly, Fate Counselor Ricardo didn't summon his messenger to provide him any clues to a powerful mystical item. About 20 minutes later, the carriage came to a halt. A huge vertical signboard with the words Lardle Bar appeared before Klein's eyes. He habitually took out 2 Solian notes and handed them to the carriage driver. It was only when he saw the worn face of the carriage driver did he suddenly realize something. He was overseas and this was a colony of Faceac. It had its own currency. The smallest denomination was the kopeck, followed by the Fey silver, and then the gold horn. They maintained the very intuitive base 10 denomination, making conversions very simple. I forgot to visit the bank to exchange for kopeck and Fey silver. I used it all at the inn and restaurant. Klein was just about to look around to see if there were any banks around when the carriage driver happily received the 2 1 Soli notes. After repeatedly checking it, he beamed with his wrinkled face. Thank you for your generosity." Klein got off the carriage. While walking towards the Lardle Bar, he was recalling the carriage driver's delighted look. "Gold pounds, Soli, and pence can be used here as well?" "Yes, Gargas Archipelago isn't that far from Toscarter and Oravi. Many items would be sold here, and many lone adventurers like to visit the Sea of Beluga whales. To have Lone Kingdom's currency being used in private is rather common. Heh. Lone's industry and economic strength is greater than the Faceac Empire. It can even be said to be much stronger. The gold pound is worth a lot more than the gold horn." Wait. Suddenly, he recalled something. 1 gold pound could be used to exchange for 5 gold horn. This also meant that 2 Soli was equal to 5 Fey silver. And in the City of White, a rental carriage cost 4 Fey silver an hour. There wasn't any prorated discounts. It was no wonder the carriage driver was so happy. Klein turned back and realized that the carriage had long disappeared. Sigh. Gently exhaling, Klein pressed down on his hat and pushed open the heavy wooden door before entering the Lardle Bar. In this world, bars near the dock and factory districts often sold lunch and dinner. Therefore, they opened around 11 in the morning. At that moment, there were quite a number of adventurers, who had nothing better to do, gathered in front of the bar counter. They ordered liquor and smoked fish or vegetable soup with oil floating on the surface. They had a great time eating all of that with bread. Drinking Lanti-proof and Nepos at noon? Are they planning to be drunk the entire day? The customs of Faceac are really unacceptable. Klein mumbled as he walked to the bar counter with a deadpan expression. He sat in a corner and rapped the wooden counter. 2 toasted bread with red sausage, a set of smoked whale meat, a bowl of thick vegetable soup, and a cup of Gaulis beer. Gaulis beer was rather popular along the eastern seaboard of Faysac. It was rather rare in Sonia Island and the Gargas archipelago. New here? The bartender glanced at Klein. A total of 4 Fey silver and 6 kopek. I'm new because I don't drink liquor? Klein ignored the bartender's question and threw 2 soli in notes. It was equivalent to 5 Fey silver and 5 kopek. Considering how he was Gehrman's sparrow, Klein held back the urge to get the bartender to give him change as he treated it as a tip. Of course, in a Backlund bar, that amount of food would have cost him about 2 soli. Having received a tip, the bartender didn't ask further. He skillfully poured a cup of Gaulis beer and pushed it towards Klein. The beer was rather black in color with plenty of foam. It had a pleasant charred taste, and there was slight stimulation in the mellow taste. It made Klein feel as though the alcohol content was rather high as he suspected if some other liquor had been poured in. While waiting for his food, he sipped his beer and silently listened to the conversations of the surrounding adventurers. And the group's conversation was mainly centered around how someone had made a windfall, who was killed by pirates, who finished off a pirate captain without claiming the bounty and instead inherited the deceased pirate captain's subordinates, which woman in Nas had an illegitimate child, or who became a laughingstock for failing to perform at a brothel. When the Gargas specialty, thick soup brewed using sweet vegetables, onions, cabbage, carrots, fish, and butter, was served before Klein, he finally heard something interesting. An adventurer suppressed his voice as he said to his surroundings partners, "Have you heard of this? There's a 4th epic ruin east of Gargas." "No." "Who discovered it?" his surprised partner curiously asked.
The adventurer looked to his left and right as he said without much thought, "Gareth discovered it."
"As you know, he's a seafarer who's good at diving. As he was drunk, he was thrown off the deck and sank to the bottom of the sea. Who knew that he ended up discovering remnants of steel buildings? They were definitely steel buildings made from human hands." "And then," his partner pressed. The adventurer chuckled. "Gareth followed the ruins and discovered an abandoned sea well of unknown depths. It was already filled with seawater, but it still left him with extreme horror. Holy Lord of Storms, this might even lead to the core of the land. He said that there was something summoning him inside, but he didn't dare explore it. So he floated up in fear. A deep sea well. Strange attraction. This might not be a 4th epic ruin. Perhaps it's from the 3rd epic or 2nd epic." Little Sun had mentioned that during the Dark Epic, sea monsters were subject to Elf King Sanayathrim and helped him rule the bottom of the sea. Sweet, salty, and a little tartish. Klein drank a mouthful of thick vegetable soup as he forked a piece of smoked beluga whale meat. The adventurers didn't talk about Gareth's encounter, as there wasn't any sight of heart-stirring gold or jewelry, mystical items, or beyonder ingredients at the moment. The conversation quickly steered to a few adventurers who they weren't friendly with. They mocked about how they had married beautiful natives who all turned into stout and fat women a couple of years later. Their strength could even match those of low-sequence beyonders. Finally, they concluded that it might have to do with how people from Faysac had tiny bits of giant blood running in their veins. They didn't say anything of value until Klein finished his lunch and drank his beer, but the number of people inside Lairdal Bar kept increasing. Suddenly, the heavy door was pushed open as it slammed into the wall. A top hat-donning young man who was clearly of lone blood rushed in. He shouted nervously, "Is there anyone from the Adventure Association?" "Yes. Built still owes me the creation of 1 item." Klein watched as the young men looked around frantically while constantly turning his head back. It appeared as though someone was pursuing him. Before he could consider whether to render assistance, 3 adventurers stood up from different corners. One of them was more than 2 meters tall. He had wide shoulders and firm muscles. His hair was slightly blonde, and his eyes were a deep blue. He was rather eye-catching. The strength he appears to have matches with his substance. This isn't a beyonder of quite a significant sequence. Klein retracted his gaze as he became a spectator once again as he looked out the door. Soon, a man in a linen shirt and brown jacket appeared. He was of medium build, and his lips were purple. His brown eyes could hardly conceal the intense baneful look he tried to hide. Klein instantly connected the man to a portrait on a bounty. It was the second mate of the King of Immortality Agalito, Slaughter Curtius, with a bounty of 9,500 pounds. This is a notorious pirate. Klein's nerves tensed up as his gaze locked onto the man.
He naturally hung his left hand down as his body prepared to lunge forward. Curtius swept his gaze at the 2-meter-tall giant, and saw Klein before retracting his gaze. He turned to leave the ladle bar without stopping at all. Very decisive, very alert. Klein frowned slightly, confident that he hadn't revealed any killing intent. He had even controlled his gaze very well. Was he worried about that giant? Or is his intuition very sharp to a particular extent? Just like the premonition towards danger like devils? Klein wondered as he drank the remaining Gaullus beer without participating in the private conversations of the Adventurer Association members. He left the bar and came onto the streets. Now, he didn't wish to give himself new troubles aside from finding mermaids. After circling the area, Klein discovered that Slaughterer Curtius had long departed. His whereabouts were unknown. Hence, he silently returned to his inn.
City of Silver. Inside the spire. Derek Berg once again met the chief of the 6-member council, Colin Iliad. He clearly remembered that nearly 70 days ago, Colin had told him that in 2 months he should prepare to be sent out on an exploration mission. Chapter 637. The future. Are you done with your preparations?
Colin had his back to the window as he asked without any abnormality in his tone.
With the axe of Hurricane attached to him, Derek lowered his head slightly.
I'm done.
In the past 2 months, through the patrol missions and arduous practice, he had fully mastered the various Beyonder powers of Solar High Priest. He was already not too far from digesting the potion. What he wished for the most was to obtain the Sun Pathway Sequence 6 potion formula in the next 2 to 3 tarot gatherings, so as to ensure his continual advancement. The release of Shepherd Lovia made him feel highly threatened.
He believed that only by reaching the same Sequence 5 would he have a chance of effectively putting her in check and avert the potential danger of the City of Silver. However, with the knowledge of the acting method and without the lack of Beyonder ingredients, all he needed to do was survive the various patrols and exploration missions and make enough contributions to make Sequence 6 a reachable target.
However, Sequence 5 required a specific ritual which made it relatively difficult. The grizzled Colin nodded. In another 2 days, I'll be leading a small team to the vicinity of the Giant King's court.
We will do a second sweep of Afternoon Town which we previously found, and your powers are very suitable for such matters.
Afternoon Town. Having been brushing up on his knowledge of legends over the past few months, Derek was no stranger to this name. It was an area that needed to be passed when going to the Giant King's court from the Kingdom of Silver. It was a town where humans and giants lived together. It clustered around the ancient god's residence which was forever fixed at sunset, just like the last door that separated the real world to a mythological legend. Yes, Your Excellency. Derek couldn't find a reason to reject. City of White, Nas. In a particular inn. Klein sat behind a desk as he looked at the constantly changing clouds outside the window, silently awaiting the arrival of evening. At 8, he would board the Star Pirates' flagship, Future, on Dock 6 to head to the furthest eastern front of the Sonia Sea. No matter what happened in the Gargas archipelago or this region of the sea known as a pirate's playground, they would have nothing to do with him. Therefore, he didn't attempt to hunt the small number of pirates with bounties on their heads that he met while walking in the big and small alleys or bars and casinos. He didn't want to mess up his plans of finding mermaids. My spiritual intuition tells me that Slaughter Curtius from Noon seems to have targeted me. I wouldn't mind if he wishes to send himself to his death. Well, battle strategy can be despised, but battle technique needs to be treated seriously. Without using the sea god scepter or tinder, I'm at best a little stronger than him. I'm at an advantage by being well-rounded and strange enough. Klein half closed his eyes as he imagined the gathering of countless spherical lights, and he used it to enter cogitation rapidly so as to maintain the acuteness of his spirituality. After an unknown period of time, his spiritual perception was triggered as he opened his eyes immediately. At that moment, the sun had already set in the west. The fiery red color seemed to burn the sea as long shadows were drawn out through the curtains. The shadows seemed to come alive as they danced about before distorting and standing up to project themselves on the wall. Its pitch-black darkness was like the manifestation of the immense evil at the bottom of a human's heart. Klein watched this scene with a deadpan expression. He raised his left palm high as he slowly extended his fingers. The pitch-black shadow produced a voice that sounded hoarse, as though it held sandcloth in it. While looking at Klein it said, "Gehrman Sparrow, do not interfere in the matter that happened this afternoon. This is the will of the King of Immortality." With that said,
The shadow slid down like flowing water and scattered into the darkness, having its original state restored. Klein didn't pay attention to the shadow's changes. Instead, he cast his gaze outside. He could sense that the person controlling the shadow was somewhere across the street. Hence, he didn't plan on acting upon an incorporeal entity. Indeed, Slaughterer Curtius recognized me as the crazy adventurer, Gehrman Sparrow, who loves to hunt pirates. That's why he didn't hesitate to turn around at noon. He might not be afraid of me, but there was another rather powerful adventurer present as well. The power he revealed just now is somewhat similar to the Desire Apostle in Backlund. He's more and more likely to be a Beyonder from the Devil Pathway. Heh, using the King of Immortality to scare me. Do you think I'll submit just like that? I never intended to involve myself in it. By doing so, I'm actually a little curious. Forget it. Finding the mermaids is of utmost importance as of now. I shouldn't create incidents for myself. Klein retracted his gaze as he lampooned. He was originally wondering if he should report the matter to the Church of the God of Combat in Naz, but after serious consideration, he discovered that it was likely to be meaningless. The Church of the God of Combat is the only legal religion in the Feysak Empire. The number of high-sequence Beyonders they have is definitely a little higher than the Church of the Evernight Goddess, but just by a little. Even if the demigods of the Feysak royal family and military are added, with the extensive land and numerous colonies it has, making the number of critical areas that require protection crucial, they would definitely be lacking in manpower. The Gargas Archipelago, which is far away from the Empire and in a relatively ordinary location, with the only industry being whale fishing, there's no doubt that it's only an afterthought and doesn't have any saints protecting it. According to what Klein had previously learned, the Archbishop of the Gargas Diocese for the Church of the God of Combat was only a Sequence 5 guardian. Together with the Tribunal's Inquisitor, a Baron from the royal family, and a Commodore from the military, they form the highest level of Beyonder combat forces here. Of course, the existence of sealed artifacts had guaranteed the control of the area. Klein suspected that the Church of the God of Combat in Naz had at least one Grade 1 sealed artifact. Only by doing so could they combine it with their fleets and Beyonders to ensure that the whale oil and grey amber trade industry wouldn't be under the control of pirates and not end up as one of the vassals of one of the four kings. Under any sudden assaults, they were able to use it to last until reinforcements arrived. And it was precisely because of this that the officials in the Gargas Archipelago ultimately maintained a defensive state. As long as the pirates didn't cause problems, they were allowed to freely enter and leave. Reporting things wouldn't be of any use. No wonder it's called a pirate's playground. It's no wonder Bilt wants to organize an adventurer association. Klein sighed as he gave up his previous thoughts. After dinner and resting for a while, Klein took out his gold pocket watch and opened it to check the time. Seeing that it was already 7, he held a ritual and summoned himself before responding to himself. He then brought different items into the grey fog while adjusting his inventory. As he was adventuring out at sea on the future, the Murloc cufflink and various sea god domain charms were necessary. Therefore, Klein left Tinder and the sun brooch above the grey fog. With creeping hunger as his main force, he matched it with the biological poison bottle and a revolver which was loaded with different Beyonder bullets. He still had 7 purifying bullets, 13 demon hunting bullets, and 2 exorcism bullets. Wearing his coat, Klein placed down Azek's whistle, as well as his wallet containing only 50 pounds into his inner pocket. Then, he stored the silver adventurer harmonica and charms together. After doing all of this, he touched the revolver beneath his armpit, polished the blue cufflink at his left wrist, and buttoned his double-breasted frock coat. He wore his half-top hat, picked up his black suitcase which contained only his change of clothes and some daily necessities, and left the inn for the harbor via a carriage. After waiting for a while at Dock 6, he saw a gigantic sailboat slowly appear from the distance. According to his limited knowledge of boats, Klein knew that a sailboat of such length wasn't scientific. However, this didn't deter it from cruising calmly on the Black Sea surface as it headed for the lighthouse which emitted its light. As the sailboat approached, the flag gradually became clear. The crimson but weak moonlight allowed the people at the harbor to see 10 white stars of the same size as they circled a cold eyelashless eye on the flag. Admiral of Stars. The future! The pirates and sailors who were watching over their ships exclaimed as every dock in the harbor was filled with stirred emotions. After more than 10 seconds, the defensive cannons on the 2 ends of the mountain nervously adjusted themselves and aimed at the gigantic sailboat which didn't conceal itself. Clang! 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 The distant cathedral produced light and ethereal chimes, signaling that it was 8 o'clock sharp. As the tenseness around the dock became more evident, the future came to a halt. At some point in time, a woman dressed in a black classical robe appeared at the bow. Her clothes were filled with different symbols and magic labels, making her look like a powerful warlock of ancient legends. Under the crimson moonlight, the ground beneath her suddenly lit up. Resplendent starlight scattered down, forming a long transparent bridge. The long bridge constantly extended forward before landing on Dock 6. An impressive show, as expected of one of the 7 pirate admirals. Furthermore, she's a full admiral, a rank higher than Iceberg and Ailment. Klein sighed as he wished to extend his palm to cover his face. He didn't wish to let others know that the crazy adventurer, Gehrman Sparrow, was cooperating with Admiral of Stars Katlia. At this point, I can only maintain my persona. Once I'm done digesting the potion and by the time I'm back in the northern continent, there wouldn't be Gehrman Sparrow anymore. Klein walked out of the shadows as he pressed the half-top hat on his head. He smoothly walked onto the starry bridge. His footsteps were firm as Klein walked with his back straight while being targeted by numerous defensive cannons. Under the gazes with ambiguous meanings, he unhurriedly walked to the docked future. The bridge under his feet was transparent as the dark blue seawater which was almost black-ebbed beneath him. It would make anyone with acrophobia turn limp. Thankfully, I've long become a clown. I've even jumped off a clock tower. Klein covered the last 10 meters with a cold expression before stepping onto the deck of the future. Faced with the black-eyed Admiral of Stars Katlia, who had purple tint to her eyes, he didn't show any nervousness. He took off his hat and bowed. "Good evening, ma'am." Chapter 638. Poison Expert. While Klein bowed, the purple tint in black-haired Katlia's eyes converged as they seemed to turn into an abyss that could suck up souls. What already exuded an air of mystery had turned even more obvious. She saw that the astral projection deep inside Gehrman Sparrow's ether body was pure darkness. In minute areas, there were dark flows with unending changes. She saw that Gehrman Sparrow's left hand was bright and lustrous, but it was stained with a sanguine color that couldn't be dispersed. She saw a blue luster by Gehrman Sparrow's wrist and a silver flow on his left pocket. The colors were bright and obvious as though they were connected to the illusory, stacked spirit world. There was the sound of the tide and the illusory sounds of wind surrounding the items. She saw an intermix of green and black lusters by Gehrman Sparrow's right pocket, as well as 2 points of golden, silver, and bronze under his armpit. At his chest, there was a deep grayish-white like rotting death. For mystical items and beyonder artifacts or spirituality charms in units of 10. Katlia's eyes were a little dazzled as she couldn't help but close them for a moment. She nodded as well. "Good evening, Mr. Sparrow." Even as a powerhouse who was famous across the seas, a senior member of the 7 pirate admirals, she seldom saw people who armed themselves to the teeth with beyonder items. Of course, she had also seen people with more mystical items, beyonder artifacts, and spirituality charms, but they had secret organizations backing them. They typically had several ships and more than 1,000 pirates under them. Many things needed to be turned in, split and shared, as well as sold in order to maintain and strengthen one's faction. Few things could be left in their possession as a result. However, few was relative. They could compare with what Gehrman Sparrow presently had, but Katlia had reduced her items to only 2 after several trades. They were 2 items that were sufficiently powerful and mystical enough to match her identity as a pirate admiral. Apart from the lusters representing different items, Katlia's black eyes, which were slightly purple, could also tell that Gehrman wasn't real enough. He seemed to be hidden behind thick curtains. This is the reason why he gives me the feeling like he's not a living person at the Tarot Club? He has quite a number of secrets. It involves at least a Sequence 3 saint or an even higher level angel. Katlia didn't dare take another look as the glow in her eyes were no longer as profound. Meanwhile, she mocked herself, believing that some of her guesses about the world and Gehrman Sparrow were somewhat funny. Involves a Sequence 3 saint or an even higher-leveled angel. Heh, there's nothing wrong with that, since he's like me, a member of the Tarot Club. We're definitely involved with Mr. Fool, who's likely a reawakened ancient god. After exchanging greetings, Katlia didn't engage in further small talk. She led Klein towards the cabin. At this moment, the future, which had been docked, set sail again. A long contour was drawn on the surface of the sea as it cruised east of the whale fishing route. With that, the tense atmosphere at the Nas harbor dispersed. Gazes from various sailors were cast over. Klein didn't show any signs of pressure as he surveyed the area and said with a tone as though he was back in his own home, "There are fewer people than I expected."
Katlia turned her head and glanced at him before answering simply, "East of the Whaling Route is very dangerous. Only Ludwell heads there frequently as though he's searching for something. Apart from the future, the pirate crew's other ships wouldn't join us. Similarly, a large number of sailors have been placed on the other ships. Only the minimum number needed to guarantee the successful voyage of the ship has been maintained." A very wise choice. Ludwell. That Admiral Hell Ludwell? Mr. Hanged Man mentioned him a long time ago. He said that he was beginning to study Sonia Sea's eastern end of the navigation. Klein nodded a little without a word. This was Gehrman Sparrow's bearing. He silently observed his surroundings and realized that the deck, the cabin, and spars were covered with mysterious and abstract symbols. As a whole, it looked like a gigantic ritualistic magic ceremony. It's like the Golden Dream. It's a sailboat of mystery, but it's not at the level of a ghost ship. Compared to Admiral of Stars and Vice Admiral Iceberg, Tracy, who has only become a pirate admiral for the past few months, clearly is considerably more inferior. The Black Death has nothing special about it. Klein retracted his gaze and followed Katlia to the cabin's entrance. Waiting here was a man in dungarees and a white shirt. He was in his 30s and looked strong and fit. He had thick body hair. As for his forearm, which was exposed outside, it seemed like he was donning a brown sweater. He wore a circular hair with a depression in the middle as he revealed a smile and stretched out his right hand. The first mate of the future, Frank Lee.
"Good evening, Mr. Sparrow."
Poison expert Frank Lee, who has a bounty of 7,000 pounds.
Klein instantly recognized the man. Considering how Gehrman Sparrow didn't have the habit of shaking hands, he bent his back slightly and said, "Good evening."
Frank Lee retracted his right hand and glanced at Katlia.
He said while maintaining his smile, "You seem to know me?"
"That's right. The picture I took before is on my arrest warrant. Don't mind the poison expert title. I'm a very friendly person, as long as I'm not facing those darn bastards. My greatest hobby is to study soil and figure out crossbreeding techniques. Believe me, this is the future of humanity." But the people from the Church of Mother Earth don't believe him. Katlia gave Klein an introduction in the most subtle manner. He's originally someone from the Church of Mother Earth? Crossbreeding techniques are good. As long as the quantity rises, it will be able to provide for more humans, raising the poverty line. Klein looked at Frank Lee, and he calmly said courteously and truthfully, "This is something commendable. You are indeed an adventurer who doesn't share the viewpoint of the common man. Excellent, excellent. There are just too few people like you." Frank Lee's blue eyes revealed a clear look of pleasant surprise. "I've only tried crossbreeding a bull, a cow, and wheat together, allowing calves to be born like wheat. For that, I was almost sent to court by the Church of Mother Earth. My benevolent mother, they don't understand your true will at all. Crossbreeding a bull, a cow, and wheat. You devil." Only then did Klein realize that his understanding of crossbreeding techniques was different from what Frank Lee was talking about. He maintained a stoic expression without providing any further explanation. Under the lead of Frank Lee, who was reeling in a sudden bout of enthusiasm, Klein walked through the corridor beside Katlia. After stepping on the steps and arriving at a higher level, Klein's spiritual perception stirred as he cast his gaze to a shadow beside him. A figure grew out of the distorted darkness, a thin and tall but pale figure. His cheeks were nearly transparent, and his nose bridge was disharmonious and tall. His entire being gave off a sickly feeling. "This is the second mate of the future, Heath Doyle," Frank Lee introduced with a smile. "Bloodless Heath, whose bounty is higher than yours at 7,600 pounds? Klein quickly matched the face to the correct bounty notice. Heath nodded as a greeting before receding back into the shadows. "He's a Rose Bishop." When turning around to head for the captain's cabin, Frank Lee warmly mentioned Heath Doyle's situation. "You are telling me your second mate sequence directly?" Klein nearly pricked his brows. He secretly glanced at Katlia and discovered her masked exasperation. "Are you puzzled and worried that he's a devout believer of the true creator, a lunatic who has been tainted?" "No, haha. He's a lucky fellow. Due to an incident, the ordinary him was scattered with the potion concocted from a Rose Bishop's Beyonder ingredients. The potion seeped into him, bit by bit, and he survived the ordeal. Finally, he became quite a special Beyonder. As he didn't experience the listener stage, he wasn't tainted, nor did he become a lunatic.
As long as he doesn't proactively use the Beyonder power, listen, he remains an ordinary person, Frank Lee said in a flaunting tone. What an enviable fellow. He reached sequence 6 in one go. Furthermore, he didn't turn mentally unstable like the sea serpent, Calvetua. Klein sighed silently as he watched Admiral of Stars open the door to the captain's cabin. Katlia pointed inside. Your room is diagonally across from here. Frank will send you over. If there's anything, you can come to me directly. You can have your meals at the dining hall at any time. You can also get Frank to send someone to bring food to your room. What you choose is dependent on your preference. Admiral of Stars does things in a very clear and direct manner. Yes, she's a mature and wise lady. Klein praised inwardly as he replied without a change in expression. Okay. He took this opportunity to glance at the layout of the captain's cabin, discovering that it contained a bookshelf, a full-body mirror, a table, and a carpet. She actually reads. Isn't she unable to digest all the information the hidden sage imbues in her? Klein thought in amusement. At this moment, having seen their conversation come to an end, Frank Lee passionately promoted, Mr. Sparrow, would you like a serving of roasted potatoes tonight? When you chew it, it's like beef and its taste is like beef, but it's certainly potatoes. Will I get sick eating that? Klein answered coldly, I don't eat supper. All right then. Frank Lee drooped his shoulders and was just about to lead Klein to his room. Katlia suddenly thought of something and said, Mr. Sparrow, you've likely hunted quite a number of enemies and have received several spoils of war. I'm curious about the number of Beyonder characteristics you have left. Perhaps, they can be used to reduce the remaining price of the trip. Klein considered for a moment and answered frankly. Most of them have been sold. There's Interrogator, Pugilist, and Lunatic left. He didn't mention the All-Black Eye or the Beyonder characteristic of Nightmare. He really is the most famous adventurer during the past few months. Even after selling most of them, he still has 3 sets of Beyonder characteristics. Katlia sighed inwardly as she pondered. I want Pugilist. She had a warrior subordinate from the Gargas archipelago, who had long made enough contributions to apply for an advancement. Chapter 639. Nameless, there was no reason for Klein to decline Katlia's request. He thought for 2 seconds and said, 700 pounds. Very fair. Katlia didn't haggle. Sequence 8 Beyonder characteristics typically cost 600 to 700 pounds, but there was often a premium if someone was in desperate need for it. After all, such items seldom appeared at Beyonder gatherings. Klein didn't immediately complete the transaction. He raised his suitcase and said without a change in expression, I'll give it to you tomorrow. He didn't bring the Pugilist Beyonder characteristic with him, as most items of value had been thrown above the grey fog. Katlia wasn't surprised by Gehrman Sparrow's response. She nodded. That wouldn't be an issue. She had encountered many similar cases. It usually meant that the Pugilist Beyonder characteristic was stored with items which wasn't meant to be known by others. Therefore, it was impossible for Gehrman Sparrow to open his suitcase in front of her to complete the transaction on the spot. A crazy adventurer definitely had his secrets. Katlia paused for a second before adding, there won't be any surveillance placed in your room. Whatever she could see had already been seen by her. It's fine. Klein curled the corners of his lips and coldly smiled. His previous considerations was to place down items like Azek's copper whistle and Will Septon's paper crane before holding a ritual or going above the grey fog. It was to resist any spying in the sense of mysticism. Then, he could use the washroom as a way to avoid physical surveillance. Of course, he wasn't too worried that Admiral of Stars would go overboard. He didn't believe that she was afraid of the crazy adventurer, Gehrman Sparrow, but that Katlia had no reason to do so. She definitely had milder and more concealed means of observing. For example, getting the help of a Beyonder from the spectator pathway. Klein took off his hat, bowed, and followed poison expert Frank Lee to return to his own room. Seeing him walk off at an adequate speed, Katlia turned into the captain's cabin, picked up a heavy pair of glasses and wore it. Backlund, at the Harvest Church south of the bridge. In the eyes of an ordinary person, Bishop Utravsky, whose height was that of a half-giant, put down the Bible in his hand. He prayed once around the hall and smiled. The number of believers is increasing. Is that so? Emlyn White, who was in a brown priest robe, was wiping the candle racks as he said without even looking up. He knew that the number of believers of Mother Earth had indeed increased significantly.
It would have been a miracle in the past to have a handful of people be in attendance for praying on weekdays or in the daytime. Now, there was often close to 10. Father Yutravsky looked down at the busy vampire priest and chuckled. Anyone can tell if they aren't blind. You have contributed greatly to this.
If not for your concocting of the medicine and treating the plague, and your willingness and sincerity in teaching people about medicine, our faith wouldn't have been that easily accepted by the residents of this borough.
Emlyn held a cloth and straightened his back. He tipped his chin slightly.
I was only acting.
What do you mean by our faith?
Don't lump me with you.
Emlyn's expression twisted before he said with a smile, speaking of the blind, it reminds me of a joke. It's said that the demand for blind people in Backlund far exceeds supply.
This is because they are widely believed to be most suitable to be jurors.
Father Yutravsky ignored the joke and benevolently said, regardless of the goal, you have contributed greatly to the spread of the faith of Mother Earth. Besides, this also proves that you have a kind heart.
Pooey.
I said so back then, but why didn't you believe me? Emlyn looked up at the priest's massive body before retracting his gaze in silence. After busying himself at the cathedral, he changed into his normal clothes and wore a silk top hat that sheltered him from the sun. He then walked on to Rose Street. He stealthily sized up his surroundings and didn't notice any signs of monitoring. The red glove named Leonard from before really hasn't appeared again. I thought my act of exposing his secrets and buying Tinder would result in me being constantly investigated in secret. Emlyn White shook his head indiscernibly as he felt puzzled.
In the earliest stages, he had planned on taking in the hanged man's theory to incur the investigations of the Red Gloves, so as to disrupt the monitoring from the upper echelons of the Sanguine.
He could then achieve a perfect equilibrium by using the Church of Mother Earth's Blessed, Yutravsky. But things didn't develop as he had expected. Leonard Mitchell had apparently left Backlund very quickly.
At the end of February, Emlyn had made a detour to 7 Pinster Street while he was out once, only to discover that it was uninhabited.
Without thinking about this matter any further, he walked to the end of the street, got onto a rental carriage and headed straight for the Odora Villa. He was left to a study on the first floor by an attendant where he saw many Sanguine who had recently come of age.
Among them was a Sanguine who had already become a baron.
I'm not the only one? He thought before closing the door.
He then said to the owner Cosmiodora, My lord, was I not called here because of a summoning from Lord Nibs? He had said my lord rather indifferently as though he was calling him by name.
This was because he was also a Sanguine baron. The difference was that he hadn't publicized it.
Cosmi was a very refined middle-aged gentleman.
He smiled and said, All of you are outstanding young Sanguine. My grandfather has entrusted all of you with some tests. Another Sanguine baron, Russ Bathory, who was lucky to receive an inheritance, asked, What tests are they?
Cosmi drank a mouthful of dark red blood which was concocted with grape wine as he scanned the area.
Perhaps you might not know, but the Snake of Fate from the Life School of Thought has disappeared for quite some time.
As Emlyn White and the other Sanguine looked puzzled, Cosmi continued, But I believe all of you should know that the Life School of Thought is a coalition which was barely formed thanks to their belief in fate. They allied under the massive pressure placed by the 7 Orthodox churches in the beginning of the 5th epoch and are formed by beyonders who think of themselves as absolutely rational and aloof, those that worship the primordial moon, and those that seek the essence of life and spirituality.
Due to the existence of the Snake of Fate, there hadn't been many serious problems internally. Their worship of the primordial moon was ultimately restricted to a fixed symbolic meaning. Furthermore, the process of formula exchange was melded with a master-apprentice heritage system. Unfortunately, with the disappearance of the Snake of Fate, this process has been disrupted. The primordial moon's believers rapidly turned passionate, producing a fracture in the faction that represents fate. An intense conflict ensued as a result. This matter was used by the Rose School of Thought.
It dealt quite a sizable amount of damage to them.
Emlyn White, Russ Bathory, and other Sanguine remained perplexed. After sharing the background information, Cosmi dived into the details. Worshippers of the primordial moon are our eternal enemies. They have always been hunting us, concocting us into potions to achieve strength. Now, we will not let go of such an opportunity. Here's a list of primordial moon worshippers and their situations. Whoever finds them and kills them will be the victor of this test. My grandfather, as well as various important figures, would reward you generously. If you complete a portion of the list, we will determine this by numbers. Of course, these people were selected, and all of you are capable of dealing with them. The rest will be tracked down by the important figures.
Upon hearing the first few sentences, Emlyn White had no intention of participating, despite having hatred for those artificial vampires. He found the matter troublesome, laborious, and tiresome. He'd rather stay at home in silence to chat with his dolls. By the time he realized that it was a competition, as well as sensing the gazes of Russ Bathory and the other sanguine which were cast on him, Emlyn suddenly straightened his back and tipped his chin.
No problem.
His red eyes slowly swept across the other creatures in the room.
On the future, inside a spacious room with an attached bathroom, Klein stood in front of the window, looking out into the undulating blue ocean. In a good mood, he breathed in the cold winds that came from the north.
The flagship of the Admiral of Stars had already separated from the other ships in the fleet as it began to cruise alone.
After an unknown period of time, 2 whaling ships appeared ahead. Once they noticed the flag containing the stars and I flying from the future, they immediately responded nervously. They quickly adjusted their positions, aiming their starboards over, their cannons ready to shoot at any moment. At the same time, spears and harpoons, which were shot using explosives, were directed in the same direction. The blonde and large fishermen from the Gargas archipelago held tridents and guns as they braced for an attack, either by standing or crouching. Klein also noticed that there were a number of women with figures similar to the Hulk. It was obvious at a glance that they were heavy and good at fighting. The future didn't mind their welcome. It continued cruising past them, heading deeper into the whaling route. After cruising for a while, Klein saw more pirate ships ahead. They were clustered around the sea route's periphery, their motives unknown. The future came close without standing on ceremony. Immediately, the pirate ships reacted like startled birds as they quickly retreated. Sensing the future slowing down, Klein left his room in puzzlement. Just as he approached the captain's cabin, he discovered Katlia walking out. This woman wore a thick pair of glasses on her nose bridge, hiding her mysterious purple eyes. She glanced at Klein and said succinctly, "Someone discovered a ruin which is said to be from the 4th epoch at the bottom of the sea in the waters around here. We plan on taking a look while on the way."
Bottom of the sea?
Ruin from the 4th epoch? Klein instantly recalled the rumor he had heard from the Lairdal bar. So this piece of news has already spread? I was wondering why I got to learn it so easily, he said inwardly in enlightenment. Chapter 640. Female pirate Klein had a certain degree of curiosity towards the outcome of the exploration. He didn't ask further as he walked past the captain's cabin and walked down the stairwell. After a few seconds, he felt his throat itch. He couldn't help but raise his fist to his mouth and cough. Klein wasn't surprised by such a development, as it was inevitable. He had carried the biological poison bottle for more than 2 hours last night. Only when it was late at night and his confirmation that Admiral of Stars and crew didn't have any intention of attacking him did he move the mystical item into a black suitcase. Sadly, he ended up falling sick. Of course, the amount of time he brought the biological poison bottle with him wasn't considered long. His body wasn't in a weakened state, so his resulting illness wasn't anything serious. He just felt his tonsils swell in pain. Katlia, who was walking slowly behind, saw this scene, but she didn't find it a problem. Instead, she found it normal. It was common knowledge for knowledgeable Beyonders that mystical items were bound to have negative side effects. Furthermore, they would learn from the 7 Orthodox churches and categorize those with serious side effects which made them impossible to possess or use for prolonged time as sealed artifacts. The reason why Katlia had sold or exchanged many of her low and mid-level mystical items was firstly because she wanted to better strengthen her survivability. Secondly, the various negative effects from multiple items were troubling. Often one could avoid one but not the other. Some negative effects might even stack and synergize into something worse. Therefore, to most Beyonders, the disadvantages surpassed the advantages. She discovered that Gehrman Sparrow had used mystical items, Beyonder weapons, and spirituality charms to arm himself to the teeth. While being amazed, she was already guessing at the type of negative effects he was facing. From what she saw today, it was a temporary simple illness. With steady steps, Klein arrived on the deck and saw Frank Lee. He was still dressed in a white shirt and dungarees. His arm was stained with dirt as though he wasn't afraid of the cold winds that blew down at him. "Good morning, Gehrman." Frank warmly waved his hand and said, "Here, try my latest product. This is definitely the most welcomed item at sea." As he said, he raised his other hand. In it was a wide and fat fish of an unknown breed. "No, I don't want to know what monster you have cooked up this time.
Klein paused in his footsteps as he looked at him with a cold expression.
Frank Lee didn't discover any problems with his attitude. He pulled out a dagger from his waist and stabbed the fish before slicing a hole open. Blood flowed out and accurately landed in a large beer cup on the deck.
It didn't emit any fishy smell.
Smell that?
It's such an intoxicating alcoholic fragrance. Frank Lee half closed his eyes as he fervently said, "This is a fish who has red wine replacing its blood.
As such, the wine contains lots of nutrients." Klein realized he was at a loss for words.
Frank looked at the surrounding sailors in excitement before saying to Gairman Sparrow, "Do you know what's the most troubling matter out at sea? That's when we run out of alcohol without being anywhere close to shore. As long as this kind of fish can rapidly reproduce and become the sea's primary produce, then we won't be lacking any alcohol no matter where we are. By the way, they can be categorized by species. Some will produce Lanti-proof, others Nepos, red wine, and beer. The beer needs to come from sharks or whales. Otherwise, there won't be enough.
Isn't the most troubling matter the lack of water?
Of course, all of you can use beer to replace water most of the time because it doesn't easily spoil."
Those poor fishes.
Klein was pondering over a response to Frank when Katlia came on deck. She walked past him and questioned her first mate.
"Is Nina done with her preparations?"
"Yes, she has already finished a bottle of Nepos." Frank pointed at a shadow formed by the sails. "The so-called preparations are to drink a bottle of Nepos, a specialty of Fesak?
The Nepos which can light a fire?"
Klein suddenly felt that Nina, the lady mentioned by the first mate, was likely someone with Fesak blood. "Captain, I want a bottle of Sonia blood wine more." In the dark, a female figure slowly stood up and walked over. She was more than 1.8 meters tall. Her blonde hair was casually tied up into a high pigtail. Her facial features weren't anything outstanding, but she had the striking traits of someone from Fesak. Her skin was fair and her eyes were dull. This lady named Nina wore a black tight suit made of fish skin. The top and bottom seemed to be a one-piece, fully accentuating her stunning figure. Such a style was rather sexy to begin with. Nina's breasts were also far above what was normal. It was obvious what the surrounding pirates were looking at. Klein felt a little embarrassed and wished to move his gaze away. However, on second thought, Gairman Sparrow was definitely not such an untried person. All he could do was empty his gaze and look straight at Nina's face. "Gairman, this is our bosun, Nina. She's also the navigator's assistant. Haha, her sequence's name is Seafarer." Frank Lee still didn't hold back in his introductions. Apart from his research of crossbreeding, this poison expert is rather simple. I now recall that this lady named Nina has a bounty of 3,600 pounds. Her nickname is Seabed Murderer. Sigh, after seeing so many bounty notices, there are some I can't immediately recall. Klein looked at Nina's eyes and nodded calmly. "Good morning, ma'am." Nina held back her smile and sized up Klein. "Good morning, Mr. Sparrow. I'm very curious if Vice Admiral Ailment is really as charming as the rumors say." As a female pirate who had mixed with low and mid-class people for extended periods of time, she was always very frank and direct towards both men and women. She didn't show any coyness. She had originally planned on asking Gairman Sparrow if she was lacking in charm, or ask if he was the cold type, which resulted in her being completely ignored or him showing any reaction. But considering how the man standing before her was a powerful guy, an adventurer who nearly successfully hunted Vice Admiral Ailment, or a lunatic who could draw his gun and shoot at any moment, she rationally held back her jesting words. She switched to asking about Vice Admiral Ailment. "How am I to answer you?" Klein gloomily said. "Her bounty is extremely charming." Nina was taken aback, somewhat at a loss for a response to continue the conversation. Hence, she turned to look at Admiral of Stars. "Captain, do we begin now?" Katlia, who felt her bounty flash through her mind for some baffling reason, nodded. "Begin." Just as she said that, Nina took large strides to the side of the ship. With her right hand supporting herself, she leaped into the sea, swimming downwards like a gigantic black fish. At the same time, there were a few splashes. A few sailors had jumped down as well to provide her aid. She begins at the mention of it. She didn't need any additional time to prepare. This lady has the temperament of the Church of Storms, as expected of a beyonder from the sailor pathway. Klein looked out the ship as he couldn't help but cough. "You're sick?" Frank Lee asked directly. Klein nodded slightly and said, "A little."
Frank thought for a moment.
He didn't say a word as he rushed back into the cabin. His destination unknown.
By the side, Katlia nudged her heavy glasses and smiled. Frank is a poison expert, but he's also an outstanding doctor. As expected of someone from the plantar pathway.
Klein didn't ask further as he stood there, awaiting Nina's preliminary exploration. Seeing the sudden silence that became somewhat awkward, Katlia took a few steps forward and said, seemingly in passing, "In another day, we will be leaving the Whaling Sea route."
But we're at least a week from those waters? Klein thought before asking. That is if we follow the Whaling Sea route. In fact, this will lead further north and be more roundabout. I know of a secret sea route that can allow us to reach the waters you wish to go to in 2 to 3 days. Katlia's gaze looked at Klein's eyes through her thick glasses, as though she wanted to tell how much he knew of the extremely dangerous waters.
Klein considered and simply said, "Very good.
That's exactly what I want. In addition, those waters are more illusory than real." Katlia retracted her gaze in thought as she looked at the entrance to the cabin.
Frank Lee ran over and held a green apple in his hand.
This is the outcome of another one of my projects. It's a crossbreed of medicine and fruits. It makes the consumption of medicine more enjoyable.
He beamed as he handed Klein the apple.
I'm afraid I'll end up even sicker after eating it.
Klein glanced at Admiral of Stars and saw her nod gently. Only then did he inwardly force himself to accept the apple while appearing calm on the outside.
He then bit down at the apple. It had the taste of a normal apple. It just had a lot more juice, and the insides were softer.
After a few bites, Klein discovered that his throat suddenly wasn't hurting.
He didn't realize when he stopped coughing. I have to say that it's rather magical. As long as it doesn't involve animals and humans, Frank Lee is really a genius that should be taken seriously in the Church of Mother Earth. Unfortunately, he ultimately became a devil-like person. Klein looked at the poison expert and said frankly, "It's healed."
Very good.
Frank didn't praise himself as he began casually introducing the pirates on the deck. After a while, Nina and the other supporting sailors swam up to the surface and returned to the ship. She held a metallic piece that had been rotten into an identifiable state, and a piece of black hardened mud that was filled with honeycombed holes. She grumbled to Katlia, "Captain, there's no deep-sea well. That well's mouth isn't even bigger than my breasts. Of course, it's very deep and dark. It's unknown what's hidden in it." She gestured using her hands. Exaggeration is a common trait of pirates and adventurers. Katlia nodded without using the term bragging. The diameter of the well's mouth is that small?
Klein puzzledly looked at the item in Nina's hand, as he politely diverted his gaze from her body which had streams of water flowing down.
Katlia's gaze moved in sync with his as she said, "Go into the details." Chapter 641. A well-mouth that humans can't pass. Nina was a pirate who had risen up the ranks. Often, she might be easily irritated, but she was very experienced at handling matters. She was a rather reliable person. After some thought, she gave a description in a serious manner. The well's mouth is at a rather deep depth along the seabed. I need enough time to adjust myself before I can acclimatize to the temperature and pressure of the area. That's why I took so much time to get there. It isn't easily discovered, but the remnant iron buildings are indeed rather obvious. I found them once I got acclimatized. They've already completely collapsed or rotted. There's no way to imagine what they originally looked like. However, I could tell that they definitely spanned across a great distance in the past. It's just shrunken by a great deal now. When Nina said this, she chuckled and scanned all the men around her. A real female pirate is indeed different. Klein sighed from the bottom of his heart. From his point of view, be it Admiral of Stars Katlia, Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina, or Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy, none of them could be considered a pure female pirate. All of them hailed from major factions or secret organizations. When they were low-sequence beyonders, they were either not at sea, or they were following important figures, so what they did were relatively safe matters. Otherwise, they were independent adventurers who had never been tainted by the characters and atmosphere of low or mid-level pirates. After Nina finished laughing, Katlia pointed her finger to the rusted item that could hardly be described as a metal beam. "This is a portion of the iron building?" "Yes, Captain. As you know, I don't know much about history or mysticism. I could only bring some back for your inspection. You're an expert on this." Nina smiled as she handed the metal beam over. Then, she pointed at the black piece of hardened mud which was filled with holes on its surface. Not far from the iron ruins, I found a well. It's not very big. If it's to be described with the word huge, then I've definitely seen plenty of huge cannons. Those drunken adventurers are better at bragging than us pirates. This is the mud from the inner layer of the well. I can't imagine how such patterns could be formed. Nina's finger repeatedly struck the honeycombed dots on the black mud. Klein originally believed that they were marks left behind by dense shots with very tiny projectiles, but after a careful inspection, he suspected that they were remnant patterns after something had rotted. Each spot was very shallow as its edges spread outwards in an irregular pattern. Nina handed the black mud to Katlia as she continued describing. The well's mouth is really small. Even a child from Nas wouldn't be able to enter. It's very deep. I even felt that it was bottomless. In that environment, the interior was completely dark as though something was slowly summoning me. Yes, slowly. I found a few rocks nearby and threw them in, but there wasn't any response. In short, it's filled with water. Katlia held up the metallic beam and black mud. Through the thick glasses, she observed them seriously. Since the mouth is very small and humans can't enter them, there's no need for us to begin the exploration immediately. It will be very dangerous. Let's wait until I figure out the secrets hidden within these items and whether the ancient well is worth us taking the risk before we return to make an attempt. Aye, Captain. The wet Nina was trembling as a result of the cold winds. The way she wavered made all the surrounding pirates stare straight at her. Katlia nudged her glasses and said to Nina, "You can drink a bottle of Sonia blood wine. There's no limit for the rest." Long live the captain. Nina cried out in joy. An underwater well that humans can't enter. Klein, who had no desire to explore it, summarized Nina's description. Suddenly, he had a strange idea. Humans are unable to enter the well, but that doesn't mean that non-humans can't do it. Many deep-sea fishes aren't necessarily that huge. There's a significant chance that they can pass through the well. As the sea god, he had the means to make marine creatures do his bidding while wielding the scepter. There's no rush. Let's see if Ma'am Hermit is able to figure out anything from these two objects. I'll consider whether I'll explore it on the return trip. Otherwise, I might attract some exaggerated danger. There's still not enough information regarding this. There's no way to do any divination. As his thoughts wandered, Klein's expression remained deadpan. At that moment, Katlia shot him a glance out of curiosity. Then, she retracted her gaze without leaving any traces. Why did she suddenly look at me? She was seeing what I was doing? It's impossible for her to know that I possess the sea god's scepter and can make marine creatures do my bidding. That's not right. She knows, but she only knows that Mr. Fool wields Calvetua's godhood scepter, not the world. Unless she has figured out that the world is the fool. But that's even more impossible. Even Mr. Hangman is still stuck at the concept that the world is a blessed. She hasn't even realized this point. Viewing this from a different point of view, I'll consider it from Admiral of Stars's angle. She's someone being pursued by knowledge, and she's a follower of Queen Mystic. She's loyal to the Moses ascetic order, and she has roamed the sea for years. She has plenty of knowledge and experience, so it wouldn't be odd that she knows that the sea god domain possesses the beyonder power to control marine creatures. Therefore, after realizing that humans are unable to pass through the ancient well, she naturally made the connection with the scepter in Mr. Fool's hand. Does she plan on requesting for help in the future? She looked at me to figure out if the world has also grasped the corresponding information or have similar ideas. Many ideas went through Klein's mind. With the powers of Clown, he forcefully maintained his indifferent expression. He didn't react abnormally in any way. As Nina was about to draw the Sonia blood wine, Klein pressed down his hat and returned to the cabin. Just as he was about to approach the door, a figure surfaced in his mind suddenly. In a room in the cabin's upper level, the windows were tightly shut and the curtains were drawn. There were a pair of blurry eyes hidden behind them, silently watching the crowd on the deck, as well as Gairman Sparrow. Who is it? Klein didn't stop. His body didn't show any hesitation as he entered the cabin normally as though nothing had happened. At 3 in the afternoon, the bright but not scorching sunlight shone into the garden adjacent to Stone University. Michel Duth was already a senior associate professor by 40. He was wearing a long tailcoat and a beautiful bow tie as he waited by the door. Yesterday evening, he received a letter. The sender was from the attendant of the richest aristocratic family in Eastchester County, the Hall family.
The person who wrote the letter was the daughter of a member of parliament from the House of Lords who wielded immense influence.
She was Miss Audrey Hall, who was deemed to be the most stunning gem in Backland.
This noble lady had mentioned in the letter that she had learned from a gathering that Mr. Michel Duth was an outstanding collector and an aficionado of this domain. She had a great desire in paying a visit. Michel Duth didn't have any reason to refuse.
Soon, a classic carriage with a family emblem arrived at the door.
2 servants who had been instructed to open the outer gates made of iron railings, led the carriage around the garden and arrived in front of the house.
A housekeeper was the first to alight, followed by guards and maidservants. Following that, a hand wearing a long white gauzed glove was extended outside.
With the help of the maidservants, Audrey elegantly stepped onto the carpet which Michel had paved.
Michel was first taken aback before his eyes lit up.
He felt as though the flowers in the garden had instantly faded.
He took 2 steps forward and took off his hat to bow. "Welcome, my honorable lady. Your visit is an honor for me and my family."
Audrey took off the veiled hat and passed it to her maidservant before exchanging a few pleasantries.
Then, she followed Michel Duth into the living room and entered the collector's room on the first floor.
Here, Michel finally found his confidence as the master of the house.
He began pointing at his collection and providing an introduction from the left. "This is a helmet that appeared in the White Rose War. After lots of research, it can be determined that the owner is a member of the Sauron family. Back then they were still considered royalty. The golden helmet had an intricate design. There were avian and flying wings that adorned it, and the visor was formed from pieces of golden scales. My ancestor obtained his first aristocratic title in that war," Audrey replied with piqued interest. She had already adjusted her mental state ahead of time. She was to appear as though she was really here to tour the collections. The failure of the 20-Year War had caused the kingdom to suffer years of humiliation, but it also carved out several heroes. Michel resorted to flattery. "The White Rose War happened after the 20-Year War and before the Battle of the Violated Oath. There, Lone defeated Intis and became strong again." Michel continued introducing his collection as Audrey solemnly listened, raising questions from time to time as she conversed with him. Finally, Michel's finger pointed towards a notebook with a black cover. "This belonged to a knight stationed on Sonia Island in the 20-Year War. This knight's name has already vanished in the long rivers of history. This notebook is the only proof of his existence. He once stood fast until the very last moment on Sonia Island. This notebook is not only a first-hand account for the research of that portion of history, but it also hides certain problems. The knight's grammar has many uncommon habits. This might be a clue to aid us in determining his exact identity." Audrey instinctively believed that the notebook was her target. Hence, she only leaned in a little. Indeed, the black cover had obvious patterns. Together, they outlined an abstract image of a dragon. From Michel's tone and minute expressions, his interest is focused on the content and not the item itself. "He doesn't particularly treasure it. I have a high chance of purchasing it."
Audrey calmly made a judgment as she turned her head.
She then smiled at Michel Duth and said, "What are the uncommon habits exactly?" "Enjoys using short sentences, very simple and short ones," Michel described in a flaunting tone. Audrey was always a good listener. She looked at him with a smile as she listened with focused attention. This made Michel speak more. As she listened, she suddenly felt that the knight's grammatical habits were somewhat familiar.
"That is..." Audrey's eyes darted around slightly as she quickly remembered the source of the familiarity. This was a grammatical habit of Dragonese which she had diligently mastered.
Chapter 642. Killing 3 birds with 1 stone. A knight who knows Dragonese and even used it in the critical stage of his growth. It's no wonder that the psychology alchemists wished to obtain the notebook he left behind.
Audrey was enlightened as she stopped her wandering thoughts.
She happily and seriously discussed the problem that stemmed from such grammatical habits with Michel Duth. Soon, they concluded the discussion over the notebook as Michel began introducing the other items. Time passed as the tour slowly came to an end. Audrey had planned on raising her request of purchasing the notebook to their next meeting in order to make her goal less obvious.
However, in a friendly atmosphere and with the naturalness of their conversation, she sharply sensed that it was an opportunity.
Hence, with the powers of lie, she made her cheeks blush red. "Mr. Duth, that helmet from the Sauron royalty that originates from the White Rose War is a keepsake of my ancestors. Pardon my presumptuous, but can I buy it from you? Also,
The Notebook of the 20-Year War. I'm very impressed by the knight that stood firm for Sonia Island and also wish to have it. I know it's not a polite request, but I wish that you can understand how I feel. Of course, you have the right to decline. Her eyes moved as she obviously darted them around, partially deliberate and truthful to express her lack of confidence and embarrassment. Michel subconsciously moved his gaze away as he said with a hoarse and slow voice, I'm a collector. I won't sell my collection. His tone and the words he used aren't firm enough. In the intel I previously gathered, he's a gentleman who values his reputation greatly. Using cash to purchase his collection is probably unacceptable. The reason why the psychology alchemists didn't get someone else to complete the mission is firstly because I have a way of earning contribution points, and secondly, it probably took the associate professor's attitude towards such matters in mind. I have to change my approach. Before the visit, Audrey had already carefully decided of different tests according to the intel she received. After some thought, she changed topics. Mr. Duth, I heard that you're requesting Stone University to build an ancient relic research center? Yes, that has been my goal for the past few years. Michel looked at Audrey and answered frankly. Audrey smiled faintly and said, I'm very interested in the research in this area. I also feel a deep respect for you and hope to see your wish fulfilled. Well, I'm planning on donating £1,000, a nearby piece of land spanning 2,000 aries, and a manor with rather good returns to the faculty you are from at Stone University. I hope to have a non-profit basic relic search and preservation foundation set up. I know it's not a lot, but I will drum up support from the ladies and gentlemen I know in order to get them to make a certain amount of contributions. Mr. Duth, I think you're the most professional relic collector and researcher I know. I'm wondering if you're willing to be the person in charge of this non-profit foundation? 2,000 aries of land near the university. That's worth about £6,000. Together with the manor and the cash, Miss Audrey would be donating nearly £10,000. With such a non-profit relic search and preservation foundation, the difficulties I would encounter to get my research grants approved would be drastically lowered. Michel paused for a few seconds before revealing a sincere smile. He bowed solemnly and said, My honorable lady, the importance you place on academia has left me touched. Its glow is enough to match your beauty and upbringing. I believe I have no reason to reject your invitation. I've already recorded the contents of the notebook. I will send it and the helmet to your residence tonight. Treat it as a gift from a sincere friend. Success. Audrey was delighted as she wished to praise herself. However, she appeared reserved and indifferent. She didn't do anything that was improper. It's my honor, she said earnestly. Although the two items were definitely not worth £10,000, it wouldn't result in any loss on her part. In her plans, this suggestion contained 3 important goals which yielded 3 returns. The first goal was naturally to obtain the item and complete the mission. She would then successfully obtain the hypnotist potion formula from the psychology alchemists. The second goal was to enhance her prestige, standing, and image via donating to academic research and the preservation of ancient relics. This was something most nobles and tycoons needed to do. Even if the donation wasn't today, Audrey would have to donate £3,000 or more to the various charitable organizations. Therefore, she believed that her father, Earl Hall, wouldn't stop her from doing this with a few of her properties. The third goal was that by having a foundation that focused on the search and preservation of ancient relics, it made it easier for her to come into contact with historical records or mysterious items of value. Audrey didn't need to personally do anything. All she needed to do was sit at home to receive items that might be beneficial to her. It was equivalent to using £10,000 to produce even more money to establish her own faction. Of course, if Michel Duth hadn't accepted this exchange, then she had other plans. The kingdom's Higher Education Commission had someone from the Hall family, as well as noble friends she knew. As long as the associate professor had anything he needed, she was certain that she had the means to satisfy him. However, Audrey didn't like such methods. She had a nagging feeling that it was shady and would harm the public interest. After discussing the matter, Audrey stayed for a little longer and chatted idly for about 15 minutes. It made the wrapping up process not as sharp and abrupt. Following that, she first left Michelle's house and rode her carriage back to the Hall family's villa in Stone City. Past 8 in the evening, she received the Sauron royalty's helmet and the notebook from the 20-Year War. Audrey wore a pair of white silk gloves and sat before her desk with piqued interest. She placed the helmet to the side as she began flipping through the content in the notebook. She discovered that the records were sparse. The early records indicated how the knight who was stationed in the ancient Elvish island had learned how to brew Sonia blood wine, how he chased after women, how he spent the boring days. In the later records, it entered the period of the 20-Year War. It mainly included his cursing of the people of Saga, his grumbling about his companions, and the consideration towards his plans to stand fast. It also included the end of how the Sonia island was first lost. Apart from the grammatical habits being similar to Dragonese, there aren't any serious problems. Nor can I find any hidden clues. Audrey frowned as she closed the notebook. She had used methods derived from mysticism to do her checks, but they were to no avail. This made her unwilling to waste time as she planned to turn it in to the psychology alchemists. As her thoughts raced, she suddenly had a new idea. Mr. World and Mr. Hanged Man will often consider problems from different angles to provide suggestions. Should I learn from them? Well, viewing it from a different point of view, if the content of the notebook isn't problematic, would the physical item actually be what the psychology alchemists are after?
What's so special about it? I didn't discover anything. It belongs to a knight who's accustomed to using Dragonese. That knight must have experienced something. Divination. Yes, divination. Perhaps I can find the knight's final location using divination with the help of the notebook. And this might be related to a dragon. Since it's a dragon, there's a high chance that it's a mind dragon, a representative of the spectator pathway. Clues involving it would indeed be something the psychology alchemists will pay close attention to. Audrey, that's some nice thinking. Audrey's eyes turned crystal clear as it seemed to hide a clear resplendence. She couldn't help but turn her head and looked at the golden retriever sitting by the side. Susie glanced at her owner and barked. Audrey, do you want me to praise you? No, there's no need. Audrey turned her head back, feeling a little embarrassed. Then, she discovered an important question. She wasn't able to divine things herself, or it could be said that the revelation that she received from divination would be highly inaccurate. There's no way to confirm it. No, I can seek Mr. Fool's help. A secret deed ritual. It can only be performed on my body and not towards an external object. Artificial sleepwalking? It's similar to secret deed rituals, so it wouldn't do as well. Sacrifice it to Mr. Fool and get him to do the divination before bestowing it back to me? No, that won't work. It will appear rather disrespectful. He isn't my father or teacher, but a real god. Using such a method is way too casual and somewhat sacrilegious. Audrey's thoughts slowly went from Mr. Fool to divination. Although she was rather incapable of divination, she had a certain level of understanding in the corresponding knowledge. She soon locked onto a particular method of divination. It was to seek the help of a third party's strength, an unknown or mysterious existence, via certain ritual. The most classic example of such a method was magic mirror divination. Yes, it's indeed very dangerous, but the danger stems from the possibility that the target is filled with malice or one that can cause a person to break down immediately. But I don't have such worries. I can seek Mr. Fool's help. Audrey blinked and held down her agitation as she said to the golden retriever, Susie, guard the door outside. I will use a mysticism method to study this notebook. Didn't you use them before? Susie asked, puzzled. She's getting harder to fool. Audrey's eyes darted around as she said confidently, I plan on using magic mirror divination. Don't worry. I'll make the plea to a safe existence. All right. Susie determined that Audrey was speaking the truth. She took a few steps before turning around to exhort her. Audrey, you need to be careful about being possessed by a mysterious existence. I know, Audrey replied without feeling worried at all. From her point of view, if Mr. Fool really wanted to do something to her, he had countless opportunities in the past. There was no reason for him to wait until this day. After Susie opened and closed the door by herself and went out, Audrey sat in front of her desk and recited the honorific name of the Fool to request the use of magic mirror divination. After a while, Klein, who was on the future, went to the bathroom and headed above the gray fog. There. He heard Miss Justice's prayer. That can be done? That's right. As a mysterious and unknown existence, I can be the third force in a magic mirror divination. Klein allowed it while feeling amused. Audrey immediately picked up the notebook, sat in front of the dresser, and lit a candle while facing the mirror. Chapter 643. Klein's version of magic mirror divination. With the curtains drawn tightly and all the lights extinguished in the room, Audrey followed the requirements of magic mirror divination and completed the corresponding preparations.
Of course, she didn't specially choose a specific time, as there wasn't any need to be that troublesome when getting Mr. Fool's help. Looking at the candles and reflected light in front of her, as well as her reflection, Audrey picked up a bottle of extract in excitement and some unease. She then dripped a few droplets onto the dim flame. As the mild and refreshing fragrances filled her nose, for some baffling reason, Audrey recalled the times when she was still a mysticism enthusiast. In the beginning, she would also commit all kinds of mistakes. She would realize that she had forgotten to prepare the essential oils and extracts that would please the deity at a critical moment during the ritual. All she could do was make do with perfume, and her attempts no doubt failed. In fact, according to the information which Mr. Fool shared, he would similarly respond even if I had used my perfume. Audrey exhaled slightly and, using cogitation, calmed herself down. She knew that her uncontrolled thoughts weren't ordinary behavior coming from her. The tiny bit of anticipation and nervousness had been magnified by lie. After making sure she was in an optimal state of mind, Audrey clasped her hands and pressed them to her mouth and nose as if in prayer. She sincerely chanted softly, "The fool that doesn't belong to this era. The mysterious ruler above the gray fog. The king of yellow and black who wields good luck." The secret incantation gently echoed 7 times as Audrey felt the surrounding darkness had the inclusion of something which was somewhat indescribable. It was like an undercurrent hidden beneath the water surface. Looking up, Audrey reached out her right hand and passed it through the still candle flame and stroked the mirror's surface from top to bottom. At this point, the magic mirror divination was basically done. If the mysterious and unknown existence's interest was piqued, it would respond through the mirror. Above the gray fog, in the ancient and magnificent palace, Klein looked at the crimson star representing Miss Justice expand and contract as it rippled with an illusory glow. Finally, it was tainted with a nearly black feeling of serenity. It condensed into a circular halo the size of a mirror that appeared to lead to the outer world. It's different from past rituals. Interesting. Klein leaned back into his chair and extended his spirituality to make contact with the black circular hole. Silently, his vision changed. The long bronze table and the crimson star overlapped with the spacious room which was illuminated with candlelight, becoming distinct once again. At this moment, Klein felt that a mirror had become an extension of his body or eye. It allowed him to clearly see and interfere with the real world despite being above the gray fog. Yes, clearly. All the objects in Klein's vision no longer looked blurry as they appeared distinctly in his eyes. His gaze suddenly froze for 2 seconds. In front of him was a golden-laced, white-dressed lady. Her long blonde hair was casually tied up as they smoothly and luxuriantly flowed down. Her emerald eyes reflected a somewhat palish flame, looking as deep as the ocean and also as pure as a gemstone. Her facial features and the shape of her face were matched with a stunning beauty. Her bearing and elegance were clear and pure. Klein shifted his gaze away as he felt guilty for some baffling reason. I nearly imagined her to be a demoness of quite a high sequence. Thankfully, I recalled in time that Miss Justice is a beyonder of the spectator pathway. It's impossible for her to become a demoness. The smell of this extract isn't bad. Very unique. It has a very subtle feeling. The mystical item created from that faceless beyonder characteristic? Miss Justice made it into a necklace. Klein's gaze landed on the mystical item which was disguised as a diamond necklace. Then, he heard Miss Justice say with utmost anticipation, "Mirror, mirror, please tell me the location of the owner of this notebook." Audrey knew that she was asking Mr. Fool, but mirror, mirror were words she had always wanted to recite from the stories she had heard from a young age. She finally had a chance to use it in practice. The failures in the past don't count. Yes. Audrey nodded inwardly. Klein instantly looked at the black notebook placed between Miss Justice and the candle. He discovered that his spirituality could easily spread out with the help of the mirror. He could hold the divination medium as though he was using his hand. Above the gray fog, he quickly wrote the corresponding divination statement. The location of the original owner of the notebook. With one hand holding the notebook and another hand holding the piece of paper, Klein recited as he leaned back in his chair. With the help of cogitation, he quickly fell into a deep sleep. Audrey looked at the mirror intently with her emerald eyes, awaiting Mr. Fool's reply. After a few seconds, she saw ripples being produced on the mirror's surface. It's a success. Magic mirror divination really works. Audrey's eyes widened as they reflected the scenes flashing inside the mirror. It was a view of a village from above. The scene zoomed in as the dragon drawings on the various buildings gradually turned clear.
A cathedral quickly occupied the mirror in its entirety before being replaced by the cemetery attached by it. Finally, the scene was fixed on a tombstone in a corner. On it were words that had turned blurry as a result of the elements.
The only thing that could still be discerned was the name, Lindalira.
At this moment, the mirror suddenly darkened before restoring to normal. It reflected Audrey and the candle in front of her once again. Isn't this the village which had the customs of dragon worship? The knight who wrote the notebook is named Lindalira, and is from that village. He returned to his hometown after the loss of the 20-year war and stayed there until his death? Or was he sent back to his hometown as a corpse? That village is in Eastchester County. Stone City is also part of Eastchester County, so it's very understandable that the notebook which Associate Professor Michelle obtained stems from there. There's indeed a mind dragon living in the sea of collective subconscious over there. Feeling enlightened, Audrey thanked Mr. Fool and ended the magic mirror divination. Under the candlelight's illumination, she stared at the notebook for a moment before deciding to hand it over. She wanted to know what the psychology alchemists would divine or figure out. At the very least, the present me lacks the strength to come into contact with that mind dragon. That's all I can do. Besides, even if the psychology alchemists really discover anything and benefits from it, once I slowly rise up the ranks in the organization, some of that will belong to me. Audrey's mood very quickly turned positive once again. Above the gray fog, Klein rapped the corner of the long bronze table. With Miss Justice's description, he made his judgment. The notebook and the village had something to do with a dragon, and dragons often implied treasure. What a pity. Miss Justice's strength is lacking. Otherwise, I would have encouraged her to explore it and pray to the sea god, if something happens while I provide support to her via various means. Yes, it's too dangerous for her. It can only be set aside for now. If the psychology alchemists didn't discover anything, perhaps we can attempt it in the future. Klein suppressed his regret as he recalled the experience of the magic mirror divination. This kind of divination is extremely advantageous for the third party. There's almost no price to be paid to connect to the real world. If I so wished, I could have torn out of the mirror in my spirit body form. But to the user, it's indeed dangerous. They will appear under the sights of an unknown existence without any protection. From there, they can be possessed, controlled, cursed, and corrupted. Klein sighed from the bottom of his heart. He wasn't worried that Miss Justice would abuse magic mirror divination, as she had the best and safest target to pray to. There was no need for her to seek anyone else. And that would be me. Klein retracted his finger and sat at the end of the long bronze table and waited in silence for 20 to 30 seconds. Soon, he returned to the real world. He didn't stay too long since he was on the future. There was someone watching him from the dark. After leaving the bathroom and putting away Azek's copper whistle and Willow Septon's paper crane, Klein glanced at the crimson moon which had been shrouded by clouds as he pondered silently for a moment. He put on his half-top hat, pulled open the door, and went into the corridor. After taking a few steps forward, Klein deliberately slowed his footsteps and glanced at the first room on the left through the corner of his eye. Based on his judgment, the mysterious pair of eyes that were silently observing him and the deck during the day was in that room. Klein walked slower and slower as he nearly stopped in front of the door. He didn't hide the extension of his left palm as he reached for the handle when scenes naturally surfaced in his mind. Not far behind the door was a clothes rack with nothing hanging on it. Faint starlight scattered across the clean floorboards. There was a sense of solitude and serenity that lacked the aura of humans. The windows had opened at some point in time as the sea breeze blew in from the outside, lifting the curtains which weren't too heavy. There's no one there? Klein had planned on probing the area, but he immediately retracted his left palm and walked towards the stairs as though nothing had happened. When he arrived on the deck and was taking in the cold night breeze, Klein strolled on the starboard with a cold and casual expression as though his main goal was to come out for a stroll. Suddenly, he saw a man sitting ahead of him. The man was wearing dungarees and a white shirt. Frankly, Klein didn't stop as he approached. The man sensed something as he turned his body halfway around to look at the person approaching. He was none other than poison expert Frank Lee, but he no longer wore a smile. Streaming down the corner of his mouth was blood-red liquid. Klein pricked up his brows without saying a word. Frank Lee suddenly raised his hands and grabbed a silver-scaled fish that wasn't struggling. He said in depression, "It failed. Their lifespan is shorter than I imagined. It's impossible to breed them, even if they are planted in the ground." As he spoke, he raised the silver-scaled fish in his right hand and bit down on it. "That's good. Otherwise, I'm really afraid of the kind of abominations you would create. So, you are drowning your sorrows with alcohol, no, fish?
Klein silently heaved a sigh of relief.
Chapter 644. Laughter. Klein couldn't go against his own wishes to console Frank Lee, nor could he bring himself to tell Frank Lee that not being able to breed red wine fish was a good thing. All he could do was pretend that this was a trivial problem and not provide a response. He walked 2 steps diagonally and circled around the starboard before looking far into the undulating sea. By then, the clouds high in the sky had thinned. The crimson moon's moonlight brightened up the rather dark night. In such an environment, Klein could see the nearby scenery.
There were dark clouds that hung low, and he discovered a hurricane swishing back and forth, encompassing an unknown swath of sea.
Under the illumination of the silver lightning, fine rain danced amidst the wind, forming a scene that resembled the dawn of the apocalypse. Such a terrifying disaster was only a few nautical miles or even shorter from the future, but the future didn't seem affected. Only the wind had become a little stronger. This is the meaning of a safe sea route: to advance by the side of a storm. Without a good navigator, just traveling normally might push the ship into a disaster.
Klein turned his head to look where the ship was heading. He saw a little illumination and fog being emanated.
The visibility was extremely low, and using just the naked eye was very difficult to discern if they were in a dangerous or safe zone. Such situations weren't obvious west of Oravi Island. But here, it was common once they took the secret sea route.
Klein was just about to retract his gaze when he saw a black, massive object seemingly hiding in the periphery of the storm.
A sea monster?
He suddenly recalled some of the rumors he had heard at the different bars he had been to.
After steering away from the safe sea route, it's very easy to encounter all kinds of monsters. Some of them are behemoths and possess intense offensive power. Once they surfaced from the sea, they could finish it in one mouthful. The future didn't stop advancing. Before long, it closed the gap between it and the gloomy but massive object.
Klein finally managed to discern the entity's appearance and discovered that it wasn't a sea monster, but a gigantic sailboat which was even larger than the future.
The sailboat was nearly 200 meters long. With its bow and stern raised high, it appeared like a crescent. Its surface was black.
The cannons were arranged in 3 rows in an untidy manner on the side of the ship.
There was order from top to bottom.
Apart from the mast, the portions that extended out of the deck was similarly tall and massive.
It was at least equivalent to a 5-story building. This ship's most odd feature was that it only had 1 sail, and on it was the drawing of a black tomb.
The death announcer. A heavy voice sounded in Klein's ears.
At some point in time, Frank Lee had thrown the silver-scaled fish whose blood had been replaced with red wine away and approached his side. The first mate, who had a bounty of 7,000 pounds, held his head heavy as his muscles remained tense. It was as though an attack would be launched any time from the minute changes of the gigantic sailboat. Death announcer? Klein was first taken aback before he recalled what the name represented. It was one of the most legendary and infamous ships on the 5 seas. It was the flagship of the King of Immortality Agilito. We actually encountered one of the 4 kings. Klein clicked his tongue silently as he uncontrollably entered a highly vigilant state.
However, he maintained a superficial level of indifference and calm as he continued looking at the death announcer.
Recalling how the second mate of the death announcer, Slaughterer Curtius, who had a bounty of 9,500 pounds, had recently appeared in Nas and warned him, Curtius came to an understanding. He was no longer puzzled as to why he would bump into the death announcer not far from the Gargas archipelago. After putting aside this question, he made connections with even more rumors. And among these rumors, there were a number which could be confirmed to be an actual description. King of Immortality Agilito is a middle-aged man who's so pale that he's on the brink of rotting at any moment. The bounty placed on him by a single country reached as high as 100,000 pounds. His former enemies are all dead, regardless if they were pirates, adventurers, or members of a naval fleet. Only the other 3 members of the 4 kings remained alive. He has never entered into direct combat with an official demigod. He is extremely restrained in such matters. No one really knows his exact sequence. No one knows what his beyond powers are. He's cruel by nature and enjoys killing. He can launch an attack on any person or any ship at random. He liked to find excuses to rip apart promises. Other than his nickname as the King of Immortality, he was often nicknamed the Untrustworthy. Thankfully, I'm on the future. The King of Immortality will likely give Admiral of Stars a free pass. After all, She's one of the 7 pirate admirals. No, the 4 kings and the pirate admirals can cooperate or be at odds normally, apart from the pirate convention organized by the King of the 5 Seas. With the King of Immortality's character, he might not leave any chance of survival. Just as this thought flashed in Klein's mind, he heard a deep, rumbling horn. Whoosh! The sailors who were resting in the cabin jolted awake immediately. Without wearing their clothes, they ran to the different cannons on deck to make preparations to do battle. The future instantly went from a peaceful state to a combative one. Klein turned his head and looked up. He saw that the captain's windows were already open. Katlia wore the usual black dress as she stood there and observed the death announcer. She wasn't wearing the thick glasses, and her pitch-black eyes were tainted with some purple, making them mysterious and deep. Indeed, she's also worried about a sudden attack from the King of Immortality. Klein retracted his gaze and looked at the death announcer, which had its tail raised up. At this moment, the 2 ships had just passed each other by. The pirates could see their counterparts on the other ship. Similarly, those pirates were also looking over. They maintained a silence resembling that of a statue, as though they had zero emotional fluctuations, brandishing their knives and blowing at the guns. They were being extremely provocative. At that moment, just a matchstick was enough to trigger the tense nerves and begin a war. Finally, the death announcer didn't take any actions. It continued silently anchored on the spot, watching the future pass it by before it distanced itself. Phew! At Klein's side, Frank Lee didn't conceal his exhalation. He produced a smile and said to Klein, "Heh, there has always been many rumors about the King of Immortality's strength. Others say that he's really a demigod, while others say that he's only a sequence 5. He is able to reach the level of a sequence 4 thanks to the death announcer. But regardless, he has lived long enough. Tell me, do you think crossbreeding him and my fishes would enhance their survivability?" Frank suddenly had an idea. First, you need to capture the King of Immortality. Otherwise, make him interested in your fish. Klein lampooned before calmly saying, "You can discuss it with him." Frank Lee was taken aback as he sighed. Depressed. "He won't agree to it. He will plant me into the soil." Just as he said that, the death announcer, which had opened a gap with the future, suddenly turned its sails. A shrill laughter which was filled with malice sounded from several hundred meters away as it blanketed the future. Ha ha ha! Ha ha ha! The laughter resounded constantly. It switched from being hoarse to chaotic, sounding like ravings or singing at times. The sailors on deck fell to the ground one after another as they tried hard to cover their ears, but all they could do was struggle in pain. A number of Beyonders began to produce fish scales on their bodies. Klein was similarly affected. He felt that his brain was instantly injected with all kinds of thoughts. There were the good, the bad, the bright, and the dark. They were abnormally disordered as they combined with the constantly changing laughter to produce a swelling feeling that could burst one's brain. Klein's facial expression distorted slightly as inconspicuous flesh tendrils began to start wriggling under his skin. If he hadn't experienced the true creator's ravings and Mr. Door's cry for help, or suffer similar torment when he passed the gray fog each time, giving him a certain level of resistance, Klein would definitely be like poison expert Frank Lee, pressing his head, kneeling down with a ferocious expression to resist the pain brought from the terrifying laughter. Klein noticed that some short orange hair was growing from Frank's face, making him seem to transform into a bear. At that moment, the symbols and magical labels on the future's walls, deck, and mast lit up. They became like a resplendent sea of stars in a moonless night. The terrifying laughter, which was either sharp or hoarse, didn't weaken, but everyone was distanced from one another in a second. The sounds that came from a further distance away sounded empty and illusory. Klein's swelling head instantly received reprieve as he used the rest of his strength to look up. Behind the opened windows in the captain's cabin, the Admiral of Stars's face had additional traces of gloominess, and they looked like they would crack apart at any moment, producing horrible items. At that moment, Katlia's palms pressed down on the windowsill as bits of starlight swirled around her, seemingly matching the future which was on the resplendent sea. Whoosh! A squall stirred for no reason as the ship began its own adjustment. Despite the future having so many of its sailors down, it sped up instead of slowing down. It quickly opened up a gap from the death announcer. Klein looked at the room with a mysterious pair of eyes that observed the deck, and he discovered that the windows were rattling from the strong winds without any signs of abnormalities. Whoosh! Amidst the strong winds, starlight descended to form a swath of floating ice as they dragged the future into a rapid flight. Finally, the death announcer vanished behind it.
The terrifying laughter which could make a person lose control or go mad turned more illusory and distant. Frank Lee lowered his hands and panted before barely recovering. Many of the sailors on the deck were still tumbling about and struggling in extreme pain, but their condition didn't worsen. This ability of the King of Immortality is truly impressive. There's almost no way to defend against it. It's no wonder he's one of the 4 kings. Klein frowned slightly as he sighed. Although he was experienced and rather knowledgeable, this was the first time he was being directly attacked by a demigod in the true sense of the word. He discovered that even Agalito, who was ranked last among the 4 kings, similarly made him feel weak as though it was impossible to resist. With Agalito's character, will he make the death announcer pursue us? Although there's a high chance he would wait for slaughterer Curtius to return, that possibility cannot be excluded. If he chases up, I'll pray to myself and use the sea god scepter to give him a maelstrom and a thunderstorm to wipe him out. After making the decision, he once again looked at Katlia. The pirate admiral's expression was already ghastly pale. However, there were no longer any signs of darkness. The starlight that twirled around her slowly extinguished one after another. Chapter 645. Calming method. Following the complete disappearance of the surrounding astral glow, Katlia lowered her head and said to Frank Lee, who was slowly recovering, "Let them calm down." She was referring to the sailors who were still struggling in pain. Just as she said that, Katlia shrunk her body back as the windows closed. At that instant, Klein vaguely saw a green vine grow upwards, covering the Admiral of Stars in layers. As he didn't sense any danger or wickedness, he intuitively believed that it was a method in mysticism which Ma'am Hermit used to treat her injuries and recover her energy. A power of her Beyonder pathway? Or is it from some mystical item she possesses? She began treatment without any worry, and allowed Frank to deal with the chaos on the ship. She's not afraid that the death announcer would be able to chase up to us? How far did the future fly in that last pounce? Klein no longer held his neck up as he turned to look at Frank Lee. This first mate, who was both a poison expert and a capable doctor, had already retrieved a coiled soft tube from the pocket of his dungarees. It was connected to a small glass bottle, and on the other side was an embedded thin and sharp needle. "A sedative I concocted," Frank Lee said with a forced smile while still having pangs of fear. "I've bought something similar before. They were all given to Zombie Merrick." Klein surveyed the area and said, "This might not be enough." "No, it's not for them. I need a helper. They will receive the help of beer, which comes with a sedative effect." "Haha, they're often rowdy once they're drunk, so I've added the necessary elements in most of the alcohol buckets," Frank explained in passing. Spiking their drinks without any notice. Klein nearly twitched the corner of his mouth. At that moment, he had a deep appreciation for the aptness of the nickname Poison Expert. Simply because he found the pirates rowdy when drunk, Frank had added a modified sedative to most of the alcoholic beverages without any sense of guilt or shame. It was as though he was doing something very ordinary. This fellow is a really straight and warm person in certain aspects, but in other aspects, he's more terrifying than a devil. This is because he doesn't believe that what he does is evil. How did the Church of Mother Earth produce such a crazy scientist? Klein controlled his expression and followed Frank Lee from a distance and found the bosun, Nina, who was squirming in the shadows of the bulkhead. This pirate with an exaggerated figure was slumped there, writhing in pain. She kept scratching the deck, producing ear-piercing sounds as bloody marks were left behind. Just watching the scene made Klein feel pain in his fingers. "Gammon, help me press her down to prevent her from struggling." Frank raised the needle and tube in his hand. Klein didn't object to it, but he didn't say a word. He calmly crouched by the side and pressed down on Nina's shoulders. He felt his hands slip the moment he touched her, finding it difficult to grab her. It was as though she wasn't a lady but a gigantic fish covered in slippery scales. Klein instantly corrected his actions. Using a clown's precise control, he grabbed Nina firmly by the shoulders. However, Nina's struggling was surprisingly strong, far greater than Klein's. Soon, he felt his fingers turn sore as he could hardly continue. As expected of a Sequence 7 Beyonder from the Sailor Pathway, while I'm not a Beyonder who excels when it comes to physical strength, if not for the need to feed it, I can activate Creeping Hunger and switch to steal Mavadi's soul and use the strength of a zombie as a most suitable response. As these thoughts ran through his mind, Klein saw Frank approach, crouch down, and press his knee onto Nina's back. His muscles bulged as he quickly stopped Nina's struggling. A beyonder from the planter pathway has quite a lot of physical strength as well. However, Mr. Frank Lee, it's probably difficult for you to get a girlfriend if you use such crude manners against a lady. Of course, you definitely don't mind. You could totally let your child grow from the soil. Klein lampooned as he watched Frank Lee inject the needle into the back of Nina's hand. As the small bottle of sedatives was injected, Nina stopped her attempts at struggling. Klein released his hands and stood up. After a few seconds, Nina combed her hair and rolled to her feet. She grumbled at Frank Lee. Why must you always be so rough like a bear? Can't you try a different method? As she spoke, she stretched her arms without concealing the pained expression on her face. Unlike the dive from earlier, she was now wearing a linen shirt and a brown coat. She looked no different from an ordinary pirate. Frank wasn't fazed by Nina's complaints as he asked in puzzlement. How was I rough? All right, let's not argue on this topic. Let's help them first. Get the beer barrel out. Let's work together to make them drink. Gehrman, you don't mind participating in this, right? Klein shot a glance at the sailors on the deck. After contemplating for a few seconds, he asked, the goal is to let them calm down? That's right. Frank Lee nodded heavily. Can I just knock them unconscious? Klein asked calmly. This has almost the same effects as a sedative beer, and it's more efficient. He added inwardly. Nina turned her head in surprise and was momentarily stunned speechless. Frank Lee thought seriously for a moment. Okay. All right. Klein walked to a cutlass he had long noticed, picked it up, and used the dull edge to strike it at its owner. Bang! Through his precise control, the pirate who was rolling in pain calmed down and fell unconscious. Nina's expression froze for a second before she recovered. She then slowed down when passing by Klein. She suppressed her laughter as she said, I've heard rumors of you, but I never expected you to be more exaggerated than the rumors. Usually, it should be the opposite. Yes, your thoughts are very, very special. Completely different from others, and they're closer to those of Frank's. This is probably why he's able to treat you as a friend in such a short time. No, there are differences among lunatics. Gehrman Sparrow hasn't reached the level of Frank yet. Klein observed silently and gave such a reply inwardly. He ignored Nina and held the cutlass and walked across the deck, knocking the sailors unconscious and waiting for them to wake up naturally. Frank wished to do the same, but he gave up his rash thoughts when he was asked by Nina if he could guarantee that he only knocked them unconscious instead of killing them. He entered the cabin and brought out a beer barrel and acted according to his original plan. Bam, bam, bam. Klein struck as he walked all the way to the bow. At this moment, an elder in his 50s with a pointed bonnet had gradually come round. When he saw the cold and crazy adventurer approach, he hurriedly tried to stand up and blurted out, No, I don't need it. I'm already fine. I'm fine. There's no need to explain. It's very clear. Klein held back his amusement and turned for the bow. At this moment, the elder introduced himself. I'm the navigator of the future, Ottolov. Navigator? Klein turned his head and discovered several books dropped around Ottolov. They were either spread on the ground face up or down, flat or sideways. Haha, I fell from above and brought them with me. They nearly went mad, Ottolov explained. Klein shifted his gaze towards his eyes and discovered the colors of the deep sea in his blue eyes. It's not the pair of eyes that were observing me in the day. But this feeling is somewhat similar to the Admiral of Stars. They are of the same pathway? Klein retracted his gaze and watched Nina and Frank Lee calm the other sailors. Just as he was about to look back to see if the death announcer had continued its pursuit, Ottolov suddenly shouted, Be careful! Whoosh! A huge wave struck the bow, causing the future to shake vigorously. If not for his balancing ability as a clown, Klein would have fallen like Frank. And when the huge spray pattered down like rain, it drenched his half-top hat and double-breasted frock coat. There should be a steam iron here, right? The act of a crazy adventurer washing his clothes doesn't violate his persona. It's weird if he doesn't wash his clothes. I should have worn clothes in the style of the Rorsted Archipelago natives. At that instant, Klein felt a series of heartache. He saw a storm ahead with huge waves coming one after another as they surged high up like mountains. He could sense the crazy winds and the rumbling thunder. We've come to the boundaries of the safe sea routes. The flight from just now might have allowed us to lose the death announcer's tail, but it has also diverted the ship from its path? Klein watched as Ottolov, Nina and Frank, as well as bloodless Heath Doyle, who had appeared at some point in time, wake up the sailors as they took their places. They frantically and busily began to steer the future. Through their hard work, the future changed directions in time and tore through the gigantic waves and dodged the bolts of lightning before returning to the safe sea route. After everything calmed down, Klein released the charm from the sea god domain and breathed a sigh of relief. Looking back, he saw no signs of the Death Announcer's pursuit. He finally eased up and found that there was nothing calm about the night. After surveying the area and seeing the pirates rub their heads or gasp for breath, looking exhausted and on the brink of collapse, Klein left the deck, feeling a slight guilty conscience.
He walked to the cabin and sighed inwardly. We just left the Gargas archipelago recently, and the ship was nearly destroyed. The search for mermaids really doesn't seem simple. Following the staircase to the upper level, Klein walked past the captain's cabin and slowed down.
He observed for a moment and saw green leaves covering the crack in the door.
Everything was isolated.
He shifted his gaze and returned to his room. He considered the matter of praying to the Fool before going above the grey fog to grasp the nearby waters and search for traces of the Death Announcer by responding.
He wanted to let the King of Immortality Agalito, who attacked others for no baffling reason, to experience the same treatment as he did. No, there are eyes watching. I should try my best not to do such things.
Besides, it will only teach the King of Immortality a lesson and not seriously injure him.
It's not worth the risk. I shouldn't let my anger get the better of my rationality. I'll think about it again after advancing successfully. Klein repressed his urge. Chapter 646. Leymano's Spellbook Backlund. Outside the steam locomotive station. Furs wore a finely checkered black veiled hat with embedded blue flowers and stood by the hall at the station's entrance, awaiting her teacher, Dorian Gray. The drizzle on the streets and the cold winds blowing underground had made this female author tremble slightly. She felt that she had underestimated Backlund's spring. I wonder what Zio is doing that makes her busy all year round. Sigh, she said that she wouldn't even get out of bed when her father was still alive. Apart from going to the bathroom, both food and water would be served to her by her servants. Now, she's leaving early in the morning every day and only returning late at night regardless of the weather. She has completed one mission after another, capturing one fugitive after another. With this in mind, Furs couldn't help but admire Zio. Last week, this female sheriff had already paid off her debt and had even saved up £200. I have to say that, as a Beyonder job, a sheriff is really suited to being a bounty hunter. Of course, the choices available to her are limited to low-sequence Beyonders.
Furz's thoughts wandered as her gaze that was directed outwards had suddenly caught sight of a familiar figure.
It was a man of medium build, and he was dressed in a black suit, the most popular attire in Lone. He wore a half-top hat, and in a rare instance, his shoulders appeared broad. It was broad in an almost exaggerated sense. He was none other than Furz's teacher, one of the few remaining members of the Abraham family, Dorian Gray Abraham. Furs was delighted as she immediately went over with her umbrella in hand. With so many people on the streets, she didn't directly approach him. However, her gaze met his and saw him raise his clenched right fist towards the first button on his black suit. This means danger. Furz's expressionlessly diverted her gaze away. She smiled as she cast her gaze to a young gentleman behind Dorian, and as though nothing happened, she passed him and walked forward. An ancient family had unimaginable experience in all kinds of matters, so Dorian Gray had long informed Furs of the signals and gestures to use in urgent situations. The action from before was extremely simple. It was to inform her to stay away. The young man behind was somewhat taken aback to be stared at by the languid, mature lady. Following that, he instinctively adjusted his clothes and pressed down on his hat. Just as he finished these series of actions, Furs had overtaken him and continued heading forward. Under the drizzle, Furs circled the area and boarded a rental carriage and headed for Hat Trick Inn on Sherwood Burrows 22 Hope Street. This was the place that Dorian Gray had reserved in advance. Having spent so many years in mysticism circles, Furs, who had plenty of experience, calmly got a neighboring room and stood before the window to observe the guests that came to the inn. Finally, she saw Dorian Gray get off a carriage and walk through the door. Furs quickly turned around and came to the bend of the stairwell. She covertly observed her teacher being led to his room by an attendant. After a while, she took off her hat, messed up her hair a little before coming to room 2016, and she knocked on it. Her plan was very simple. If her teacher's response wasn't problematic, she would enter the room to converse with him. If it was abnormal,
She would pretend as though she had come to the wrong room or that she was a prostitute trying to get some business. Creak. The door slowly opened as Dorian looked at his student in front of him before looking both ways down the corridor. Then, he raised his right arm and spread his fingers to press on the second button of his suit. This meant that he wasn't controlled and that the abnormality was over. Furs let out a silent sigh of relief and instantly entered the room.
"Teacher, what happened just now?" she asked, feeling worried and concerned.
Dorian closed the door and smiled wryly. "I saw someone familiar." He sighed and added, "An enemy." It was his former student who had later betrayed the Abraham family with Traveler Balaya, and nearly wiped out the upper echelons of the Abraham family. According to what Dorian knew, his former student had already joined the Aurora Order, and was likely one of the 22 oracles.
"What did he do? Is he very strong?" Furs asked curiously.
Dorian fell silent for a few seconds and divulged a little. "Lawrence, Libero, Elisa, and I belong to a particular organization. A few members betrayed it and dealt a heavy blow to it. That was one of the traitors." He didn't mention it as a family, nor did he mention the conflict between bloodline members and the apprentices so as to prevent Furs from getting her feelings involved. How despicable! Furs immediately recalled the kind Mrs. Elisa and the friendly and amiable Mr. Lawrence.
"All right, let's not chat about such unhappy matters."
Dorian took out a piece of paper that had been folded a few times and handed it to Furs.
"Here's the astrologer potion formula. Your digestion of the Trickmaster and Apprentice potions has exceeded my expectations. This is the greatest surprise I've had in the past 10 years. I specially joined a circus." Furs didn't hide the fact, and she even felt that it was worth flaunting. As she spoke, she unfolded the piece of paper to read the astrologer's potion formula. At this moment, Dorian nodded in relief. "I'm very sorry. Due to the previous losses, I'm unable to provide you with the main ingredients of the astrologer potion. Just treat it as a final test. However, I have prepared a gift for you." As he spoke, he took out a palm-sized notebook from his inner left pocket. Its cover looked hard, and it was entirely bronze green in color. It looked rather ancient. The notebook was comprised of 3 types of paper. The yellow type of parchment had the fewest pages, while another was a yellowish-brown goatskin of about 10 pages, while the rest was ordinary white paper. On the cover there were the words written in ancient Faesak. "I came, I saw, I record." Furs's gaze moved away from the astrologer potion formula and onto the notebook. She recognized it to be the item left behind by Mr. Lawrence. It was the item she had specially traveled all the way to Pritz Harbor to hand to her teacher. Dorian smiled. "I believe you are no stranger to it." After Furs nodded, he sighed. "This is a rather potent mystical item. It can be ranked in the top 5 among all the similar items I've seen. This doesn't mean that it's more impressive than the ones ranked after it, but it's simply because the negative effects are the easiest to resolve. When the two are put together, it makes it worth a lot." "What is its name? What negative side effects does it have?" Furs couldn't disguise her excitement and agitation. Dorian caressed the notebook's cover and said, "It's called Leymano's Travels, but we prefer calling it Leymano's Spellbook. While this spellbook will expose you to more kinds of Beyonder powers, it can also allow you to record them. It will be materialized onto a particular page for long-term storage. You can use it at any time, but remember, the corresponding page will become blank again with each use, awaiting your next record." It sounds amazing. Furs felt as though she was dreaming. "I can record any Beyonder powers I see and use them once? Isn't this another kind of shepherd? The shepherd mentioned by Little Sun." "Yes, it's only limited to a single prepared battle. I wonder if I can record the Beyonder powers of a demigod. If it's possible, in a prepared battle, I'll be even stronger than a shepherd." Dorian seemed to read her mind as he explained in detail. "It can be said so. It corresponds to a sequence 6 scribe of the apprentice pathway. It's not guaranteed that a Beyonder power that is higher than this sequence can be recorded. There's a chance of failure. The greater the gap, the greater the chance of failure. Furthermore, the effects will be halved. According to the experience of past users, while chances of success against a Sequence 5's Beyonder powers is considerably high, once it reaches Sequence 4, which is the level of a demigod, it becomes relatively difficult. There might not be a single instance of success within 10 attempts. And I believe no demigod will cast it again and again for you. If it's an enemy, they would have killed you 10 times over. Do you see these? The yellow parchment is specifically used to record beyonder powers with godhood. There are a total of 3 pages, which is to say that even if you are very lucky, all you can record is 3 demigod beyonder powers, and you can only use them each once. Although it appears to have many restrictions, making it impossible to fully produce the traveling notebooks might, it isn't an obstacle for 2 types of people. One of them is a lucky person, while the other is someone with a large organization or faction backing them, the kind which has a demigod helping. Furs instantly thought of seeking Mr. Fool's help to display his powers so that she could record them. However, she immediately found it sacrilegious as she hurriedly apologized inwardly. Following that, she sincerely hoped that the supposedly strongest ma'am hermit in the tarot club would quickly become a demigod. Dorian noticed that Furz's thoughts were going astray as he continued. The pages like goatskin can record the beyonder powers of a sequence 5 or 6. There are a total of 10 pages, and the effects would be more than half of the original, roughly 70 to 80%. The remaining pages record beyonder powers below sequence 6. There are a total of 25 pages, and the effects are almost equal to the original, but they are still slightly inferior. Due to some developments in the past, the spellbook still has 5 pages with beyonder powers left. The rest are blank. You can test them for yourself. Dorian paused before saying with a solemn expression, "Before giving it to you, I have to seriously warn you that it has negative effects. After using it each time, it will make you get lost, and it's the kind that causes you to encounter danger. You have to draw a bit of your blood to smear it on the cover evenly to reduce the effects. Remember, don't underestimate getting lost. You must resolve it as quickly as possible." "Yes, teacher," Furs replied seriously. Dorian then handed Leymano's travels to Furs. "This is my gift. Teacher is really nice." Furs pursed her lips and asked, "What's the name of that student who betrayed you? What does he look like? If there's a chance, I wish to seek vengeance on him for both you and Mr. Lawrence." "No, don't think about it. You are much weaker than him. Back when he betrayed us, he was already a scribe. Now, he might even be a traveler," Dorian said solemnly. "However, you do need to remember him and avoid him. His name is Louis Veen. I'll draw a picture of him later." "All right." Furs nodded. On the future, in the pirates' dining hall, Klein met Katlia, who was exiting just as he walked in. The lady was no longer as pale as the previous night. With a pair of thick glasses, she calmly said, "Make your preparations. We will be arriving in those waters in a while." "That fast? How far exactly did we fly last night?" Klein was taken aback. "You're tuning in to the Xueqi's Martial Arts Saga YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.